May it please the tribunal. In 1938, Hitler spoke in the Reichstag, and I quote his words. National Socialism has given the German people that leadership which, as a party, not only mobilizes the nation, but also organizes it. National Socialism possesses Germany entirely and completely. There is no institution in this state which is not National Socialist. We know now the kind of leadership that National Socialism did give the German people. We know how and for what purposes the Nazi Party mobilized and organized the German nation for world dominion at the cost of war and murder. The entire and complete possession of Germany by National Socialism meant the possession of the people, body and soul, by the organizations of the National Socialist Party and government. For what purpose were the Nazis seeking this possession of the people? Their aims were to have a controlled but fanatical police state geared for military aggression. If one imagines an ersatz Machiavelli presenting what this required, he might well have considered necessary. 1, a quick method of registering your laws and decrees. For this you need a pliant and complacent cabinet with full legislative powers, the Reichsregierung. 2, quick suppression of any signs of opposition or freedom of thought. Here you want an espionage service and a police which will strike at once, the SD and the Gestapo. 3, a complete check and control of public opinion. This is provided by the pressure of a fanatical corps of political leaders on a propaganda-soaked public. 4, a Praetorian Guard who will rid you not only of any turbulent priest, but of any person with a creed of their own, and so you have the SS. 5, a spreading executive hand which will grasp the population in its clutch of physical training and mental preparation for war, which will thrust the population forward and downward when general violence is necessary, which will hold it firm in the ideologies of terror at home and abroad. What could be more suitable than the SA who had just won the battle of the streets? 6, an instrument to turn your existing military forces to your purposes, to make them ready to commit any act, even if it is contrary to military tradition and repugnant to soldier-like qualities, to give unquestioning assent to the enslavement of other nations, to cooperate and hold the ring for the agencies of oppression to destroy national life and the dignity of the human spirit. This was the function which the General Staff and High Command must perform. Speed of government, delation, absence of free thought and speech, internal suppression, external trained and calculated force. These are the eternal interlocked weapons without which tyranny cannot flourish. These are but other names for the organizations which we have indicted as criminal, and by which these defendants and their colleagues were able to lead and organize and possess a nation. When Mr. Justice Jackson addressed this tribunal on the 28th of February, he emphasized that it was not our purpose to convict the whole German people of crime. I say again that we do not seek to convict the people of Germany. Our purpose now is to protect them and to give them opportunity to rehabilitate themselves in the esteem and friendship of the world. But how can this be done if we leave amongst them, unpunished and uncondemned, these elements of Nazism which were most responsible for the Nazi tyranny and crime, and which, as this tribunal may well believe, are beyond conversion to the ways of freedom and righteousness? Nor is it only the German people that we seek to protect. All Europe needs protection. Consider the position of Europe today. Among the Germans who were Hitler's, there are many thousands of men and women who with their own hands have done murder. Murder, not perhaps of a single person, but of many. Hundreds of thousands, nay millions more, became disciples of their Führer's creed of hate and cruelty. Amongst them are those whose profession and training was to command and lead militarily and politically, men who are still as fanatical and ruthless in their lust for power as at any time during the last 25 years. You remember the words, I quote, "Fight? Why do you always talk of fighting? You have conquered the state, and if something does not please you, then just make a law and regulate it differently. Why must you always talk of fighting?" Outer politically, you have the Wehrmacht. It will wage the fight if it is required. Inner politically, you have the law and the police, which can change everything which does not agree with you. Such were the precepts of the Hoheitsträger, bearers of National Socialist sovereignty. They are not forgotten in a day. Should these men be let loose amongst the German people and amongst the people of Europe, already the difficulties of this unhappy continent are overwhelming. Apart from those who come within the definition of these organizations, vast numbers of fanatical adherents of Nazism must in any event remain at large. We have a whole generation of the German people who know no other ways than those prescribed for them by their Nazi rulers. Young men and women whose first lessons were taught by Nazi teachers, whose education was had in Nazi schools, and whose sport and recreation were found in the military exercises of the SA, are the leaders of Nazi Germany in the shape of the members of these organizations, with their corporate iniquity unnoticed, to be let loose to work their influence upon such fertile ground. The law is a living thing. It is not rigid and unalterable. Its purpose is to serve mankind, and it must grow and change to meet the changing needs of society. The needs of Europe today have no parallel in history. Never before has the society of Europe faced the problem or the danger of having in their midst millions of ruthless, fanatical men trained and educated in murder and racial hatred and in war. It is a situation which, were there or were there not precedents from the past, would justify and indeed compel unusual legal provision. In fact, as the tribunal will remember from the speech of Mr. Justice Jackson, there are ample precedents for the procedure which we are asking you to institute. If you are satisfied that these organizations as a whole are criminal, that the great majority of the members of these organizations knowingly and voluntarily supported the criminal policies and participated in the criminal activities of the leaders of the Nazi Party, then it is your duty under the Charter to declare them criminal. You may well think that your duty under the Charter is only commensurate with your duty to Germany, to Europe, and the world. The principle on which their condemnation is asked for is clear. It is a practical application of the sound theory of punishment which we learnt in our youth from, among others, the great German thinker Kant. If men use society merely as a means to their own ends, then society is justified in putting them outside society. The immensity of the problem does not excuse its non-solution. The failure to perform this legal duty may well spell terror and racial persecution throughout a continent, and for the third time in our adult lives, world war. The court and the prosecution have had the advantage of reading what is, if he will allow me to say so, a careful and learned argument from Dr. Clayfish. The criticism, however, which I should venture to make is that it is remote from the essential fact-finding function of this stage of the trial. The first 30 pages are in reality an attack on Articles 9 and 10 of the Charter, and the conclusion which is drawn that the tribunal should use the word may in Article 9 as a basis for saying, on purely a priori reasoning, that no organization can be criminal is, in our submission,
to make nonsense of Articles 9 and 10 and to fly in the face of their connotation as well as their intendment. In the succeeding parts of the argument, Dr. Clefish makes certain particular submissions to which attention might be drawn. The question is posed by him: to what extent in number, how and by whom must crimes be committed in order to be imputed to the organization? To this we say that the practical answer presents no difficulties. No one can lay down categorically how many grains make a heap, but equally no one can deny that he knows a heap when he sees one. Again, it is easy to decide on broad and sensible grounds what crimes are within the general aims of the organization. The prosecution not only accept, but adopt the proposition that in the case of each organization, certain crimes can be said to be typical and repetitive, and they draw attention to the number of such typical and repetitive crimes which occur in the evidence. Similarly, no difficulty is found in the words "in connection with an individual defendant." To say that if an individual defendant committed his crime in a capacity other than that of a member of the organization, Article 9 is not complied with, is to view this case in a non-existent vacuum. It is the whole burden of the prosecution's case that individuals and organizations are so interlocked that the common end of internal and external domination is omnipresent. Equally, we strongly contest the suggestion that a number of members were not aware of the criminal purpose of the organizations. Let us once and for all tear aside the artificial suggestion that large sections of the adherents to the Nazi Party were going about in blinkers. It is a travesty of the fact and an insult to their intelligence. We agree with Dr. Clefish that non-participation in crimes under Article 6 of the Charter and a lack of will to support the policies and activities of the organization are the preconditions of innocence. It is the basis of our whole submission that, to use Dr. Clefish's own words, the members did subordinate and work continually for the aims of the organizations and the Nazis.
Mr. David.
Much emphasis has been laid by Dr. Clefish.
Mr. David, I don't know how long. Would that be convenient to break off there, or do you want to go on a little further?
Hello, sound recording. Hello, sound recording. That is all. That is all.
Your Lordship pleases. When the court adjourned, I was dealing with some points in the memorandum of Dr. Clefish, and I continue to deal with that document. Much emphasis has been laid by Dr. Clefish and by all defense counsel on the serious consequences that will accrue to the persons affected by a declaration of guilt, not only to those against whom subsequent proceedings may be taken, but to the others besides. It is said that the stigma inflicted upon members of organizations declared criminal would prove indelible. Millions of members of organizations declared criminal would remain branded for the rest of their lives. One would point at them, saying, "Look, there goes an SA criminal." But if they are guilty, if they have supported and assisted in a system which entailed throwing the world into war, reviving the horrors of slavery, persecution, and mass murder, ought they not to be so branded? This can be no injustice. It is less, far less, than their deserts. it is the only hope for Germany and the world that our people realize and repent their responsibility for what has happened. Dr. Savasius has asked you to excuse Ortsgruppenleiters because they are members of the lower middle class who lack political experience. Can it really be that only the upper classes of the German people are able to recognize aggressive war for world domination, slavery, murder, and persecution as crimes? Yet there may be more truth in this than any dare to think. You have now seen and heard many witnesses who, some on their own admission, were themselves deeply involved in hideous crime. Have you been able to discern a sense of guilt or shame or repentance? Always it is someone who gave the orders that is to blame, never he who puts the orders into execution. Always it is some other agency of the state who was responsible. To support that state and cooperate with those other agencies is without criticism. If this is the mind of these people today, there can be no more pressing need nor greater justification for branding the guilty as criminal. I pass the next page. It is my intention to discuss the evidence in respect of those three organizations for which the British delegation has taken particular responsibility and which, in the considered submission of all the four prosecuting powers, are criminal. But before dealing with that evidence, I trust the tribunal will bear with me if I make one or two general observations upon the defense which has been put forward on behalf of all these organizations. In view of the words of Dr. Böhm, I desire to submit that no one can say hereafter that every opportunity has not been afforded them for their defense. An elaborate procedure has been evolved to obtain and place before you their evidence. 102 witnesses have been heard before your commissioners, witnesses selected by defense counsel from the many thousands of members of the organizations available. You have the transcripts of their evidence. Of these witnesses, defense counsel have selected 20 who have given evidence in this court and whom you have seen and heard yourselves. In addition to this oral testimony, you have also had submitted to you the substance of no less than 136,213 affidavits for the SS, 155,000 for the political leaders, 2,000 for the Gestapo, 10,000 for the SA, and 7,000 for the SD, a total of 310,213. And you have also had presented before your commissioners another 1,809 affidavits, either in substance or in whole, the majority of which are now contained in the transcript of the commissioners' proceedings. On the face of it, the evidence which has been given by almost all the witnesses called before your commissioners is untrue. You yourselves have seen and heard some of those witnesses, selected by defense counsel, presumably because they were thought to be the most reliable and the ones most likely to impress you. Their evidence is no better. You will remember Sievers, called for the SS, who denied knowledge of and participation in the experiments on human beings and was presented with a file of his own incriminating correspondence. The witness Morgan described the variety theatre, the cinema, the bookstalls, and the other amenities of Buchenwald. Dachau, he said, was a recreation camp. Brill, who had served as an Obersturmbannführer, lieutenant colonel, in the SS division Leibstandarte, from June until August 1941 on the Eastern Front, knew nothing of the Einsatzgruppe, the slaughter of Jews in the Eastern Territories, or of the treatment of the peoples of Poland and Russia taken into captivity for forced labor. Had the conditions in June become so changed from what they had been 2 months before, when Himmler had said to all the officers of that division Very frequently the member of the Waffen-SS thinks about the deportation of this people here. These thoughts come to me today when watching the very difficult work out there performed by the security police, supported by your men who help them a great deal. Exactly the same thing happened in Poland in weather 40 degrees below zero, where we had to haul away thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, where we had to have the toughness. You should hear this, but also forget it again immediately, to shoot thousands of leading Poles. General Hauser, one-time commander of the SS, him by staff officer. Hauptfeuer of the German Labour Front, supervising the work of that organization in Essen during the latter part of the war, and himself responsible for circulating Himmler's orders to ensure the discipline and output of foreign workers, denied all knowledge of the brutal treatment of slave labor. Rathke, called for the SA before your commissioners, described how in the spring of 1933, the SA in all German localities streamed into the churches. Schneider, another political leader called before your commission, aged 55, denied having ever heard of the boycott of April 1933. Best, the enslaver of Denmark, gave evidence before you for the Gestapo. Having seen the documents that were presented to him in cross-examination, can you believe one word of what he said? Examples of evidence of this kind could be quoted from the transcript of almost every witness that has been called to defend these organizations. Consider this evidence from another angle. We know that so-called demonstrations were organized and carried out throughout the whole Reich against the Jews on the night of the 9th, 10th November 1938, during the course of which 35 Jews were murdered, 20,000 seized and incarcerated for no other offense than that they were Jews. We know that 177 synagogues were destroyed by fire or demolished, that 7,500 stores were destroyed, and that the cost of damage to glass windows alone amounted to 6 million Reichsmarks. Even the Supreme Party Court reported. The public, down to the last man, realizes that political drives like those of 9th November were organized and directed by the party. Whether this is admitted or not, when all the synagogues burned down in the night, it must have been organized by the party. Whether this is admitted or not, can you find one single man among the 102 witnesses that have been called on behalf of the party organizations who is prepared to admit it or anything like it? Can you find one word of admission from among the affidavits that have been submitted by over 312,000 members of these party organizations? If it was not the political leaders, if it was not the SA or the SS, if it was not the Gestapo or the SD, what, in the name of all common sense, was it that organized and directed these demonstrations? We know that slave labor was employed and brutally maltreated throughout Germany. We know that in 1943, it even became necessary only in order to increase production and for no reasons of humanity, to alter, I quote, the hitherto prevailing treatment of Eastern workers, and for the party chancellery and the RSHA to issue orders to all political leaders down to Ortsgruppenleiters, and presumably to all stations of the SD and Gestapo, that injustices, insults, trickery, mistreatments, etc., must be discontinued. Punishment by beating is forbidden. But can you find one single one from all the 102 witnesses and the persons who have sworn affidavits on oath who has ever seen or heard of the mistreatment of foreign laborers, save only in one or two exceptional instances? The evidence of all of them is the same. They are asked if they knew of the persecution and annihilation of Jews, of the dread work of the Gestapo, of the atrocities within the concentration camps, of the ill treatment of slave labor, of the intention and preparation to wage aggressive war, of the murder of brave soldiers, sailors, and airmen, and they reply with the everlasting no. You may be reminded of the words of a great Irishman, falsehood has a perennial spring. Let me turn to consider these three organizations for which I am responsible, the Corps of Political Leaders, the SA, and the SS. With regard to the Corps of Political Leaders, certain general points have been made by counsel and witnesses for the defense, which it is convenient to mention before dealing with the evidence. It is said that the Zell and Blocklighters ought not to be included as political leaders, that they were never regarded as such, and in no authority or political tasks, that they were subordinate to the staff officers of the Ortsgruppe, whom the prosecution has agreed to exclude, that they were completely unimportant and in practice little more than the messenger boys of their Ortsgruppenleiter. We submit that there is overwhelming evidence that this was not so. When you examine the evidence, you find them implicated in criminal activities of many kinds. I would ask you particularly to bear this in mind, that it was the normal procedure in the Corps of Political Leaders to pass nothing in writing below the rank of Ortsgruppenleiter. The organization book of the party prescribed, I quote, "In principle, the Blockleiter will settle his official business verbally, and he will receive messages verbally and pass them on in the same way. Correspondence will only be used in cases of absolute necessity and practicality." The witness, Ma Venderborn, confirmed that this was so in practice. Between the Blockleiters and the Zellenleiters on one side and the Ortsgruppenleiters and the staff on the other, there was supposed to be no written instructions in order not to make these people of any lower rank or lower positions, not to make them too much work. In view of that, you may well think it remarkable that we have happened to find so many written documents as we have, which directly implicate the Zell and Blockleiters. In dealing with the evidence, I shall draw your attention to these documents. But I would also emphasize the other evidence you have of the vitally important role of the Zell and Blockleiters played. It has been argued that they were not Hoheitsträger, as the prosecution suggests, and various documents have been submitted by defense counsel to establish this contention. Be it right or wrong, it matters little. You will remember that they were included as Hoheitsträger in the party's organization book, which states, "Among the politische Leiter, the bearers of sovereignty assume a special position." It is answered that the organization book is inaccurate. The same is said of the SR Man, an equally inconvenient publication for the members of the SA. Is there any official publication issued by the official party publishers which is accurate? The fact is that by whatever title they may have been known, the Zell and Blockleiters formed the essential basis of the whole party system. Gauleiter Kaufmann admitted, Blockleiter and Zellenleiter were the executive organs of the Ortsgruppenleiter. Zellenleiter Schneider was asked, "Would you agree with me that without the Zellenleiters and the Blockleiters, the Ortsgruppenleiters would never have carried on the tasks they had to perform?" And answered, "Yes, that is correct." They were much more than messenger boys they are now made out to have been. Here stated that only persons who were completely politically reliable were appointed either as staff officers in the Gauss, Kreis, and Orts, or as Zell and Blockleiters, and that the people who held the positions of Zell and Blockleiters appeared to be supporters of the Nazi Party. The evidence shows the kind of tasks with which they were entrusted, which included the responsibility of assisting in forming the political judgment of the members of their area. It has been suggested that political leaders, particularly in wartime, were compelled against their will to assume their appointments. But the whole basis of the system was voluntary service, paid or unpaid, and it is confirmed by their own witness, Ma Venderborn. let me quote from his cross-examination before the Commission. May I take it that political leaders were all voluntarily occupying their offices? Answer, yes. And that also applies, does it not, to the Zellenleiter and Blockleiter? Answer, that Zellenleiter and Blockleiter were appointed through the Ortsgruppenleiter after he had had a discussion with the staff. However, if a person considered himself not up to the part, or that he was unable to do the job, or that he did not have the time, we looked for another one. Question, and it was decidedly voluntary on the part of the Zellenleiter or Blockleiter whether or not they accepted the position. Answer, yes. If pressure was brought to bear on some, as the witness Hirt suggested, it could only have happened in the most exceptional cases. If the holders of these offices were required to be completely political reliable, it would be remarkable to find among them many opponents of the party forced unwillingly to act. It is said also that because, as in peacetime, their appointments were not confirmed, their oath was taken only at irregular intervals, and because they were given no uniform, they were not, in the words of the indictment, according to common Nazi terminology, politischer Leiter of any grade or rank. I submit that there can be no substance in such an argument. They performed the same tasks, were regarded as the same officials, and held the same authority and influence as those whom they replaced. Again, it is suggested that there was no corps or organization of political leaders, but the evidence shows that the politischer Leiter of all classes formed a close and well-defined corps. They are described as a corps in the organization book. Together they had a common purpose, I quote, the complete penetration of the German nation with the National Socialist spirit. They wore a common uniform. They were issued with a common identity card, common to themselves but distinct from the rest of the population. Yearly they took their common oath to their Führer. I pledge eternal allegiance to Adolf Hitler. I pledge unconditional obedience to him and the Führers appointed by him. And as the organization book says of each one of them, the political leader is inseparably tied to the ideology and the organization of the NSDAP. There is one further matter upon which I ought to say a word of explanation. It has been argued by the defense that a great number of the Amtsleiter on the staff of the various Hoheitsträger ought not to be included in any declaration of criminality that you make against the corps of political leaders. In the same way as the Blockleiters are said to be innocent, harmless messenger boys, so too it is said that these Amtsleiter were harmless and innocent expert advisors to their respective Gau, Kreis or Ortsgruppenleiter. They may have been expert advisors, but they were much more besides, and they certainly were neither innocent nor harmless. They were properly appointed political leaders, persons who were completely politically reliable and supporters of the Nazi Party. All of them, just as the Hoheitsträger themselves, took their annual oath of allegiance, binding them in blind obedience to their Führer. All of them, though naturally they received their instructions concerning their particular fields of activity from the State Department to which they belonged, nevertheless were subject to the orders of their Hoheitsträger upon all political matters and in all matters of party discipline. You may think that these men exercised as dangerous an influence as any other political leader, because between them they were in closest contact with all grades of society and with all professions and trades. We have not documents directly implicating every class of these so-called non-political political leaders, but a great many are directly involved by the documents you have seen. I'll not enumerate them now. I shall draw your attention as I discuss the evidence. It is the submission of the prosecution from that evidence and from the general evidence of the conditions in Germany and of the influence of the political leaders. You are entitled and indeed compelled to draw the inference that if the purpose and activity of that organization was criminal, then every member of the staffs of the Gau, Kreis and Ortsgruppen ought to be included. Let it not be thought, because we have deliberately excluded those members of the Ortsgruppenleiter's staff, we have done so on account of their innocence. That decision was taken for practical rather than any other reasons, and it may well be that that decision was wrong. It has been suggested by the defense that there were officers in the various party organizations, such as the DAF or the NSV, Labour, Welfare, students and women's organizations, who are also known as politische Leiter. Their numbers are given as 1.5 million. Let me once again make it clear that if such political leaders existed, the prosecution do not seek a declaration of criminality against them. We include only Reichsleiters, Gauleiters, Krausleiters, Ortsgruppenleiters, Zellenleiters and Blockleiters, and the Amtsleiters or heads of offices on the staffs of the Reichsleitung, Gauleitung and Kreisleitung. Those political leaders who, organized on a geographical basis, were responsible for the political control of the people and the execution and administration of Nazi policy. All others are excluded. You have had a schedule showing the numbers that are thus involved. According to the party organization book for 1943, they number 600,000. It is said by the defense that that figure allows for no replacements, and that the total figure of all who have at any time held these positions is much greater. Upon that, I make 2 points. First, the figures given in the organization book show the maximum establishment allowed for each Gau and Kreis. In practice, not all of these offices were filled. In urban districts, there would be no agricultural amt. In Gaus where there were no universities, there would be no political Amtsleiter for university teachers. Secondly, the 1943 figure of 600,000 includes the political leaders of 9 foreign Gaus, 6 Austrian, 2 Polish, and 1 in the Sudetenland, none of which had existed before 1938, so that during the first 5 years of the Nazi regime, the total possible number of political leaders must have been considerably less than 600,000. The extract submitted by the defense from the pamphlet Der Hoheitsträger illustrates the increase which took place in the Hoheitsträger alone between 1935 and 1939. The figure rose from 291,000 to 581,000. In view of these considerations, it is submitted that, allowing for replacements, the total number of persons who at any time held these positions in the corps of political leaders, which we include for the purposes of a declaration of criminality, cannot have greatly exceeded the figure of 600,000 which we have submitted. And I add, ample allowance must be made for death, not only through natural causes, but through active service and bombing. And it was these men and women who constituted the very core of the National Socialism, which led the 48 million voters of Germany in the ways and to the end which we have seen. Let us consider the evidence against them under its main headings. We will see not only how they themselves directly participated in crime, but also how they actively and knowingly assisted and cooperated with the other organizations in the execution of their criminal purpose. With regard to the control of the state, Bormann, writing to Gauleiters in June 1941, stated, "For the first time in German history, the Führer, consciously and completely, has the leadership of the people in his own hands." We see one of the ways in which the leadership corps assisted in putting the leadership of the people into the Führer's own hand from the evidence of the political leaders' activity during the voting in 1936 and 1938. And we see here the participation of all ranks of political leaders. We have a complete file from the Kreis of Erfurt, Thuringia, in connection with the plebiscite of 1938. Stützpunktleiters were to report beforehand all persons in their district whom they might assume with certainty would vote no. The orders were issued by the SD jointly to the Stützpunktleiters and to all heads of sections of the security service. The heads of sections were to support the Stützpunktleiters locally as much as possible. It was said by the defense that the Stützpunktleiters referred to in that file were Stützpunktleiters of the SD and not of the political leadership. Even if you accept that explanation, it makes no difference, for it was expressly stated that the whole matter was to be carried out with the closest collaboration with the Ortsgruppenleiters of the party. The political leaders could hardly have had any doubts as to what was in store for the people whom they reported when the orders contained the significant paragraph, "The tremendous responsibility which the Stützpunktleiters had, in particular with regard to this report, is stressed once more. The Stützpunktleiters must clearly understand the potential consequences for the persons contained in their report." The tribunal will remember the reports that were rendered by the SD after the plebiscite had taken place, showing the means by which the voting papers of suspected persons were checked by the use of skimmed milk, colourless typewriters. You remember also the methods employed to force doubtful supporters of the party to vote. I quote, "The wife of the Jew, Bielshowski, who was dragged along just before closing time and voted no, as can be proved. The labourer, Otto Wiegand, had to be requested 4 times to record his vote on the day of the election, and finally only voted under force. The husband recorded his vote. To be sure, this was probably exclusively for fear of renewed arrest. And yet again, in what must be perhaps one of the most dreadful documents in all this trial, the Jehovah's Witness, Robert Searing, and his wife deposited their vote after both had been advised of their duty to vote by the police in Griefstadt and had been threatened with the removal of their child in case of non-participation. No one can pretend that these things were happening only in Erfurt. In the Gau Koblenz, the Kriegschaftsführer of Cochem, where supervisory control was ordered in several Ortsgruppen, assured the SD that it was mostly women who voted no or invalidly. In Rothenburg, the party carried out demonstrations against the bishop who had refused to vote, demonstrations which Mr. Justice Jackson so vividly described in his opening speech. Nor was it only in the 1938 plebiscite that the political leadership was active. It will be remembered that in Bremen, Kreisleiters, Ortsgruppenleiters, Stützpunktleiters were concerned in reporting all civil servants who did not vote in the election which took place on the 29th March 1936. Dr. Servatius brushes this evidence aside with a comment for which there is no scrap of evidence in support. He says, "It is shown that the commanding agency of the party in no way enters into action. These are merely individual measures of other agencies. No general practice or knowledge can be deduced from that. It is unnecessary for me to say more. The control and supervision of the German people was as much the task of the political leaders as of the SD and Gestapo. Of all the political leaders, the Blockleiters were the most essential for this purpose. They kept their index cards of every householder, index cards which formed the basis of the political judgment which the Blockleiter, Zellenleiter, and Ortsgruppenleiters, in cooperation with each other, were to pronounce. Again and again, the defense, both before the Commission and before the Tribunal, have bridled at and denied the suggestion that Blockleiters were used as spies. But what else were they when their index cards were to be completed from information which they would, I quote, have sufficient opportunity to obtain by means of conversations with the Germans, end quote. They too were urged to make certain of the accuracy of their reports. There is other evidence to show this wretched role the Blockleiters play. In the party organization book, the Blockleiter is directed that it is his duty to find people disseminating damaging rumors and to report them to the Ortsgruppe so that they may be reported to the respective state authorities. We see him spying again when we review the evidence of the part played by political leaders in the persecution of the churches. In cooperation with the Gestapo and the SD, the political leaders, from the highest to the lowest, took active part in suppressing the influence of the churches. My Lord, I think I can miss to the rest of that page 17 and the first 8 lines of page 18, which deals with the Bormann's decree, which is well known to the tribunal. And I go on at the words on page 18, let me confine myself to the lowest ranks, the Ortsgruppenleiters, Blockleiters, and Zellenleiters. You will remember the file of reports for February 1939 of the Ortsgruppenleiters in Darmstadt on ecclesiastical questions. Blockleiter and party member Kiel informs me that meetings of the confessional front are again taking place, and another in connection with a pastor, Strack. This gentleman should rarely be rapped in the knuckles seriously for once. You remember also the action taken by the Kreisleiter on these reports. The SD and the Gestapo were informed about the confessional front meetings reported by the Blockleiters. So also was the unfortunate Pastor Strack, the priest who was sufficiently well known and ripe for the concentration camp or special court. Can you doubt that it was also the Blockleiters and Zellenleiters in Thuringia who would have to make the reports required on the way in which the results of the 1938 plebiscite were received by the people, particularly in small towns and villages? Who else but Blockleiters and Zellenleiters could be employed to find out what the Catholic and Protestant clergy were saying about the Anschluss during their services? Who else but they were in a position to report whether the church bells were rung in the evening after the Anschluss speech in Vienna? Lastly, upon this subject, you have the evidence of demonstrations being organized to disrupt the service in Freising Church in 1935, in which the Kreisleiterin of the Nazi Party women's organization was taking a leading part. It was only by acquiring complete control of the state and of the people that the Nazi government were enabled to carry out their criminal aims. The political leaders were an essential element in the acquisition of this control. They supported and executed the orders of a government which they knew from the first pursued policies which were wrong by methods which were criminal. All knew of their avowed purpose to persecute the Jews. All knew of the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and the Nazi practice of arrest and incarceration without trial. Yet they continued actively to support that government and to tighten its stranglehold upon the German people. The whole of Dr. Savasia's argument as to the position of the political leaders after 1933 shows the grip in which Germany was held by the iron framework of the party, a political Iron Maiden squeezing a people to their death. With regard to the Jews, when the persecution of the Jews was an openly recognized policy and practice of the Nazi Party, the fact that men voluntarily served their party in an executive position is in itself sufficient to prove their participation in criminal activity. But we have concrete evidence of the direct participation in the persecution of the Jews by political leaders, and again by political leaders of all ranks. Within less than a year of the Nazi government coming to power, there is evidence that the core of political leaders were inciting the people of Germany to persecute the Jews. It's hardly possible to imagine that in a civilized state, in the year 1933, instructions should be issued to the political leaders under the title Jew baiting. Yet that was happening. Kreisleiters and the Gau Koblenz were to check lists of Jewish firms and businesses in their district. Once again, the importance of accuracy is emphasized. Committees were to be set up within the various Kreis, Ortsgruppen, and Stützpunkte, which had, I quote, the task of directing and supervising the communities, end quote, in Jew baiting. They were to continue the policy which had been inaugurated by the party with a boycott in April of that year. I quote, "The Kreisleiter will point out in all gatherings of members or in all public gatherings that the Jew in all countries is again carrying out a low attack which is greatly harmful to Germany. It must be made clear to the masses that no German may buy from a Jew." In view of this evidence, in view of Dr. Savashi's admission that there was no objection on the part of the political leaders to the Nuremberg decrees, and that they welcomed measures which tended to restrict the influence of the Jews, in view of the part we know they played in the 1938 demonstrations, can there be any doubt that throughout these years they were actively participating in the continuous slander and persecution of the Jewish people? It would be strange indeed if it were not so, when we see Heydrich's order to the SD issued on the night of the 9th-10th November 1938. The chiefs of the state police or their deputies must get in telephonic contact with the political leaders, Gauleiter or Kreisleiter, who have jurisdiction over their districts and have to arrange the joint meeting with the appropriate inspector or commander of the Ordnung Polizei to discuss the organization of the demonstration. The political leaders have to be informed that the German police have received from the Reichsführer SS the following instructions, in accordance with which the political leaders should adjust their own measures. It's indeed curious that these instructions should have been issued if all the Gauleiters had been so strongly opposed to such measures as Gauleiters Kaufmann, Streicher, Saukel and Wahl say that they were. Whatever these witnesses you have heard may say of the attitude of the political leaders at those demonstrations, we know that 36 Jews were killed. Of these 36 killed, 4 were murdered either by Ortsgruppenleiters or Blockleiters. It was a court composed of Gauleiters and other political leaders who saw fit to suspend or pronounce only minor punishments in the case of all the murders committed during these demonstrations by members of the party, the SS, the SA, and of the corps of political leaders. And for what reasons? In such cases, I quote, "In such cases as when Jews are killed without an order or contrary to orders, ignoble motives could not be determined. At heart, the men were convinced that they had done a service to their Führer and the party." If those witnesses for the defense that you have heard here did not understand who was responsible for those demonstrations, it was perfectly clear to the members of the Supreme Party Court. In France, lists of Jews for collective expatriation, which meant, of course, deportation to the east, were made out in agreement with the Hoheitsträger. But knowledge of these deportations and of the treatment of Jews in the occupied territories was not confined to the political leaders in France. The August 1944 edition of the information circular Die Lega contained exact particulars of what was happening in Hungary. I quote, "It was a matter of course that the German officers in Hungary did everything possible after March 19th to eliminate the Jewish element as rapidly and as completely as was at all possible. In view of the proximity of the Russian front, they commenced with the cleaning up of the northeastern area, where the Jewish element was the strongest numerically. Then the Jews were collected in the remaining Hungarian provinces and transported to Germany or German-controlled territories. 100,000 Jews remained in the hands of the Hungarians to be employed in labor battalions. By the appointed day, the 9th July, the Hungarian provinces were without any Jews. Here, remarkable consistency and severity were used in the shortest possible time." We do not know who received copies of that paper, but we do know that the defendant Dönitz contributed and that Gauleiter Kaufmann might have received it. Moreover, it appears from what it is written on the copy we possess that that copy found its way to the NSDAP in the village of Hochen near Aachen. Dönitz must have known what it contained. So must every other high-ranking Nazi official. Did Kaufmann and all his fellow Gauleiters know nothing of this hideous policy that their government was pursuing. They say so, but they lie. Will you look at document 49 of the document book which has been submitted in defense of the Corps of Political Leaders? It is a confidential information bulletin issued by the Nazi Party from the party chancellery on the 9th October 1942. It deals with the preparatory measures for the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe and rumors concerning the conditions of Jews in the East. It is a document which bears in the margin the remark, open only for G and K, which may mean for Gau and Kreis. But it shows beyond all question that knowledge of these things went far below Christ. Listen to what it says. While the final solution of the Jewish question is being worked out, discussions are lately going on among the population of various parts of the Reich territory concerning very severe measures against the Jews, particularly those in the Eastern territories. Investigations have shown that such statements, mostly in distorted or exaggerated form, were passed on by men on leave from various armies employed in the East, who personally had the opportunity to observe such measures. You may think after what you've heard that it was not possible to exaggerate the very severe measures which the soldiers on leave from the East were discussing, and must have been discussing ever since September 1941 in every village and homestead throughout Germany. But even if they were exaggerated, they are not denied. The article, which I append as a footnote, makes 5 main points. A, the measures carried out up to that date, namely elimination of Jews from the various walks of the German people and expelling the Jews completely from Reich territory, were no longer possible by emigration. B, the next generation will no longer consider this question as so vital. Therefore, the problem must be served by this generation. C, the complete segregation and elimination of the millions of Jews residing in the European economic sphere remains a compelling necessity of the German people's struggle for existence. D, starting with the Reich's territory and then going over to the other European countries included in the final solution, the Jews will, in a steady plan, be shipped to the East into large camps, from where they will be either used for labor or sent still further to the East. These very difficult problems will only be solved with ruthless severity. If they still deny knowledge of the real fate that awaited these Jews, not one of these defendants, not one of the witnesses who have given evidence before you or before your commissioners, not one of the members of these organizations can deny knowledge of their deportation. And what could they have thought was the meaning of the phrase, their complete elimination is no longer possible by emigration? On the mildest interpretation, this treatment of Jews in occupied territories is a war crime. The leadership corps is being mobilized to ensure that public opinion will not only condone, but support and encourage this war crime. If there was nothing else, this would stamp it as criminal. But it does not stop there. In the occupied territories, the Corps of Political Leaders were as responsible as any others for the crimes committed against the local population. Frick, on the 16th December 1941, in giving Rainer his instructions on his appointment as Gauleiter of Carinthia, urged him in the strongest terms to Germanize the Slovenes in the incorporated territory and eradicate the Slovenic language. My Lord, we strongly contest the suggestion of Dr. Servatius that it was admissible to Germanize former German nationals. The claim to Germanize any Slav who was held in the old empires has only to be stated, we submit, for its preposterous character to be seen. Gauleiters by themselves could not execute such orders. The subordinates had to play their part. You'll remember the instructions of 30th April 1942, issued by the Kreisleiter in Pettau to all Ortsgruppenleiters for the removal of all Slovenian inscriptions from all religious and lay sites. We know that the business discussed at the Gauleiter staff conference at Marburg included the transfer to Serbia of 2,000, the placing of hundreds in concentration camps, and retaliatory shootings. In June of 1942, when the subject was the evacuation of a prison of Chile, it is stated that the prisoners were to be transferred or shot to create the necessary space for a large-scale operation. On 13th July, half of the 400 arrested are to be rendered harmless through delivery to a concentration camp or shooting. A similar incident, including this time the shooting of a priest, is told in the minutes for March. In Poland, too, the political leaders are cooperating in the appalling treatment of the local people. A letter from the Reich Security Headquarters in November 1942 to the directors of the SD sections informs them of the iniquitous agreement between Himmler and Tierach by which a trial is to be denied to Poles, Eastern nationals, Jews, and Gypsies. It is based on the impudent theory that they are inferior people living in the German Reich's territory. What is interesting in this argument is that there is to be no hesitation in informing the Gauleiter. What possible need could there be to inform the latter, unless it was that his assistance and cooperation might be required? I pass to consider the evidence in connection with slave labor, which shows perhaps more clearly than the evidence we have in respect of any other particular crime, how deeply every branch of the corps of political leaders was involved. Every witness that has been called by the defense has denied all knowledge of or participation in the mistreatment of foreign laborers. But what is such evidence worth when you consider the documents which have been presented? The treatment of Polish agricultural workers, for whose care the Bauernführer on the staffs of the Gau, Kreis and Ortsgruppenleiters were particularly responsible, can be seen from the instructions issued to the Kreisbauernschaften in Karlsruhe in March 1941. They were instructions which were issued as a result of negotiations between the State Peasant Association of Baden and the higher SS and police officer in Stuttgart, and they were received with, I quote, great satisfaction. The Polish laborer was no longer to have any right to complain. He was prohibited transport, entertainment, and religious worship. He was forbidden to change his employment. There were to be no time limits to his working hours. I quote, every employer has the right to give corporal punishment towards farm workers of Polish nationality. The employer may not be held accountable in any such case by an official agency. Farm workers of Polish nationality should, if possible, be removed from the community of the home, and they can be quartered in stables, etc. No remorse whatever should restrict such action. We ask, can it really be possible that instructions of that nature were issued in Karlsruhe and nowhere else? Is it possible that while the Poles in Baden were being treated like animals, in the next door Gau, they were being accepted as members of the family? This is the evidence of the witness Moore called on behalf of the Bauernführers before the commission. I quote him, in practically all cases, I think with very few exceptions, the foreign laborer was accepted in the farmer's family unit. He ate with the family and moved round the circle of the farmer's family. In the industrial areas, the responsibility for the care of foreign workers was in the hands of the DAF, the Labour Front political leaders. Zaukel had decreed in May 1942 the food supply for the industrial workers in transit within the Reich is the duty of the DAF. The care for the foreign workers employed in the Reich will be carried out by the DAF in the case of non-farm laborers. All camps with foreign non-agrarian workers, regardless of who furnishes or maintains the camps, will be cared for by the DAF. In the German GAUs, the Gauleiters will have the rights of inspection and control of the execution of these orders. It is unnecessary to remind you of the appalling conditions in which the workers of Essen barely existed. Once again I ask, is it possible that the Gauleiters, Kreisleiters, Ortsgruppenleiters, cell and blockleiters, and the political leaders of the DAF in Essen were unaware of these conditions when the hutments in which the workers lived, the punishment cells in which they were confined and tortured, are situated, as the photographs show, in the very grounds of the Krupp foundries and workshops, with the works railway running within a few feet of their doors, and with the Krupp cranes stretching almost over their roofs. It is said that if indeed any such conditions did exist in Essen, they were exceptional and due only to the chaos caused by Allied bombing. But it is not so. Before the bombing of Essen had started, the office chief of Krupp's locomotive construction works was complaining that the people came in the morning without bread and tools. During both breaks, the prisoners of war crept up to the German workers and begged for bread, pitifully pointing out their hunger. And then, my lord, I have set out, and your lordships can see it, the full story of the manager who tried to get work for these workers. I ask your lordships to pass on to the top of page 29 and just look at the last sentence of the quotation. The last, which is typical of all that I have set out. Last two sentences, perhaps. Sick people are a liability to us and not a help to production. To this remark, her prior stated that if one was worth nothing, then another was, that the Bolsheviks were soulless people, and if 100,000 of them died, another 100,000 would replace them. Nor can it be true that these conditions and this treatment were confined only to Essen. In March 1943, Goebbels found it necessary to hold a conference on the question of increasing production. The minutes of the conference report, the hitherto prevailing treatment of the Eastern workers has led not only to diminished production, but has also most disadvantageously influenced the political orientation of the people in conquered Eastern territories, and has resulted in the well-known difficulties for our troops. The treatment of foreigners, which until now was markedly different for subjects of Western and Eastern countries, will be put on a uniform basis as much as possible. Particularly the living standards of the Eastern workers will be raised. We see from these minutes the attitude of the party chancellery from which the corps of political leaders received their orders. Its representative, I quote, pointed out the controversies which were already appearing and which would result for the German population if more freedom were granted for the foreigners. But the need for increased war production was all important, and notwithstanding the fears his representative had expressed at the meeting in March, on the 5th May 1943, Bormann issued from the party chancellery a memorandum to all Reichsleiters, Gauleiters, Verbändeführers, Kreisleiters, and Ortsgruppenleiters. They were instructed that the treatment of foreign laborers should become more humane, although at the same time it was demanded by members of the German race that they observe the difference between themselves and foreign nationals as a patriotic duty. Injustices, insults, trickery, mistreatment, etc. must be discontinued. Punishment by beating is forbidden. Does not that document illustrate the utter lie that every one of these witnesses for the defense has told? Does it not show more clearly than any other document the savage brutality which the political leaders of the National Socialist Party were encouraging the people of Germany? It is
not almost beyond our comprehension that in these days of enlightenment, in a great and civilized country, order should have been necessary from the government to its political leaders to discontinue the mistreatment of men and women that they had deported into slavery. Past the next paragraph. Lastly, upon this aspect of the case, you'll remember the instructions issued by the Gau Amtsleiter from Strasbourg in the Gau Baden-Alsace. Foreign women workers induced to sexual intercourse by Germans were to be taken temporarily into protective custody and then sent to another place of work. In other cases, the foreign female worker will be sent to a concentration camp for women. Their children, if they were racially satisfactory and hereditarily healthy, were to be seized from them immediately after birth to go to homes for foreign children to be looked after by the National Socialist Welfare Organization. The provisions of that order do little more than add a detail to the evidence we already have of the callous brutality which was prescribed by the party for the treatment of foreign workers. But it is an important document because it shows how many branches of the political leaders were involved in this trafficking in slaves. Kreisleiters and the Kreisobmann of the German Labour Front were to report cases of pregnancy. In fact, as one might expect, it was the Ortsgruppenleiters that made the necessary inquiries. As well as the DAF and the NSB, Labour Welfare, the order was circulated to the Gau Propagandaleiter, the Gau Pressleiter, the Gau Amtsleiters for racial policy, for national health, for peasantry, for national welfare, for questions of race, the Gau political leader of the National Socialist Women's Organization, and to similar staff officers on the Kreisleiter's staff. It's perhaps worth noting the action, or it might be more accurately described as the lack of action, which the National Socialist Welfare Organization took.
Mr. David.
I quote.
Mr. David.
Yeah, Voluntary.
Could you tell us what the word Kreisobmann means?
Yes, my Lord, the representative of the Labour Front on the Kreisleiter staff.
Yes, go on.
Lordship pleases. I quote, as far as I can find out up to now, reports the Kreisleiter of Willigen, there have been about 21 pregnancies. Of these, 4 abortions are said to have been carried out, during which 2 of the women died. Of the remaining 17 births, 5 were still born. Welfare by the NSV has not taken place anywhere. You see again the corps of political leaders working hand in hand with the security police and the SD and the Reich Kommissar for the consolidation of the German race, another institution over which Himmler reigned supreme. On this subject, it would almost be enough to say, it is admitted by Dr. Savatius that the political leaders knew that the majority of the workers were forced. It is admitted that they supervised the condition of that labor. Thereafter, res ipsa loquitur. My learned friend, the Attorney General, has already addressed you upon the vast scale on which the murder of sick and aged persons was carried out. That action commenced sometime in the summer of 1940. But long before, in pursuance of their racial policy, the Nazi government were taking steps to improve the German race. One document we have, dated January 1937, is illuminating upon the part the political leaders were expected to take. It is a letter from the Gauleiter of Southern Westphalia, setting out Hesse's decree of the 14th January 1937. I add, Eugenics had even by then been appropriated for the party racket. No other words can describe it. Here is the quotation. The question whether the person is an imbecile
cannot be ascertained solely by carrying out an intelligence test, but requires detailed evaluation of the whole personality of the human being. This review shall not only take into consideration the knowledge and intellectual abilities of the imbecile, but also his ethical, moral, and political attitude. A number of civil service doctors have, up to date, attached little importance to the reviewing of the personality as a whole. They have, up to now, hardly ever called for or used information regarding the political conduct of the supposed patient. Now that the party, by virtue of the decree of the Reich and Prussian Ministry of the Interior, is consulted in the proceedings on matters of hereditary diseases against party members, it is the task of all Gauleiters to ascertain that the law regarding hereditary health will in future be used in the sense in which it was designed. He must investigate whether the person about to be sterilized has achieved very outstanding merits for the National Socialist movement. If the Gauleiter reaches this conviction and feels that he must use his influence to prevent the sterilization, he will report to this department. It needs little imagination to see the abuses to which a decree such as this might be put, abuses which might well prove a convenient weapon for the Nazi party. That letter from a Gauleiter went to all Gauamtsleiters, Gau inspectors, and Kreisleiters in his Gau. From the fact that it is stated that the Department for National Health was to carry out preparations for cases to be put before the Gauleiter, it is clear that the Amtsleiters for that Department of National Health were also closely involved. My Lord, I have then collected the evidence on euthanasia. As the tribunal were addressed by the Attorney General, and the evidence has been recalled to their attention by my learned friend Colonel Griffith-Jones, may I summarize what the pages contain in the interest of time? My Lord, the remainder of pages 32 and 33 show the church opposition to euthanasia and the party support. I deal at the foot of pages 33, and from there, pages 33A and 34, with the question of whether euthanasia is a war crime, and show the evidence that it was deliberately used in order to organize the population for war and restrict the number of useless mouths in the country during the war. And then, my Lord, if I might resume, these matters being contained in the intervening pages, on page 35, line 6, Lord, I just want to show how it's related to the lower groups of the political leaders which we are considering. My Lord, that is after dealing with the various reports and objections to the murder of 270,000 persons on this excuse of euthanasia. In line 6 I go on. Kreisleiters from all over Franconia were reporting in similar terms. The Kreisleiter from Louth wrote to the Gaustab Amtsleiter, "The doctor also informed me that it was well known that the commission consisted of one SS doctor and several subordinate doctors, that the patients were not even examined, and that they only pronounced the verdict in accordance with the medical history noted down." Then Mrs. Marie Kerr lost two of her sisters in that way, and wrote to ask the Reich Minister of the Interior under what decree they had been killed. The defendant Frick's office passed the matter on to the Gau Stab Amtsleiter in Nuremberg. I quote, "I request that you investigate whether Kerr is politically reliable especially whether she does not have church connections. In case this should be so, for my part, there are no misgivings if you give care the desired information orally. The Gaustabamtsleiter passed that letter on to the Kreisleiter. The Kreisleiter passed it on to the Ortsgruppenleiter, who reported, I quote, that one can inform Mrs. Kerr. She is calm and circumspect. In February 1941, the Ortsgruppenleiter of Augsburg reported on the wildest scenes imaginable, which had occurred in his village when the local sanatorium had been cleared of patients. You may think his attitude was typical of the great mass of political leaders. I quote, "These incidents during this action, which is after all necessary, are to be condemned all the more because even party members themselves did not shrink from joining in the lamentations of the other weeping spectators. It is even said that these poor victims, as they are regarded by the clergy and the religious inhabitants of Augsburg, were taken to the Catholic Church for confession and communion shortly before their departure. It seems absolutely ridiculous to want to take away by an oral confession the possible sins of people, some of whom completely lack all mental powers. My lords, it has become manifest during these proceedings that other political leaders share the views of that Ortsgruppenleiter as to the absurdity of any oral confession. It is unnecessary for me to remind you of the other reports, except to mention that in addition to the Gaustabamtleiters, the Kreisleiters and the Ortsgruppenleiters, the Gau-Organisation-Leiter also becomes involved. The leadership corps was up to its elbows in this bloody business. The corps of political leaders take their share of responsibility for the mistreatment of prisoners of war. In September 1941, Bormann circulated to Gauleiters and Kreisleiters the regulations of the OKW for the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. From the receipt stamp of that document, it appears that the Gau training Leiter was the official on the Gau staff chiefly concerned with these matters. You remember the directives contained in these regulations. They were based on the fact that Bolshevism is the deadly enemy of Nazi Germany. The Bolshevist soldier has therefore lost all claim to treatment as an honorable opponent in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The feeling of pride and superiority of the German soldier to guard Soviet prisoners of war must at all times be visible even in public. The order for ruthless and energetic action must be given at the slightest indication of insubordination, especially in the case of Bolshevist fanatics. With Soviet prisoners of war, it is already necessary, for reasons of discipline, that the use of arms should be severe. You remember the special Einsatzgruppe set up by the SD to screen Soviet prisoners of war in the prisoners of war camps in order to discover and eliminate their leaders and intelligentsia. These orders, circulated to Gauleiters and Kreisleiters, explain the purpose and the method of work of those special purpose units and state the armed forces must rid themselves of all elements among the prisoners of war which must be considered as the driving force of Bolshevism. The special conditions of the Eastern Campaign demand special measures which can be carried out on their own responsibility, free from bureaucratic and administrative influences. No Gauleiter or Kreisleiter can tell this court that he did not know that Russian prisoners of war were being murdered. It was not only for their information that political leaders received these instructions. Bormann, writing to all Reichsleiters, Gauleiters, Verbände Führer and Kreisleiters in September 1944, emphasized the cooperation of the party in the commitment of prisoners of war is inevitable. Therefore, the officers assigned to the prisoners of war system have been instructed to cooperate most closely with the Hoheitsträger. The commanders of the prisoner of war camps have to detail immediately liaison officers to the Kreisleiters. Thus, the opportunity will be afforded to the Hoheitsträgers to alleviate existing difficulties locally to exercise influence on the guard units and better to assimilate the commitment of the prisoners of war to the political and economic demands. It was to be the task of the political leaders to orientate both the guards and plant owners again and again, politically and ideologically, and this was to be done in cooperation with the DAF. It is unnecessary to repeat the evidence of the treatment of Russian and other prisoners of war employed by Krupps. The political leaders were as callous of their prisoners of war slaves when they died as they had been when they lived. Gauleiters and Kreisleiters received from Bormann Frick's instructions for the burial of Soviet prisoners of war. Tarred paper was to make do for coffins, no burial ceremonies or decoration of the graves was to be allowed, costs were to be kept as low as possible, and the transfer and burial is to be carried out unobtrusively. If a number of corpses have to be disposed of, the burial will be carried out in a communal grave. What did the last rites of those whom they had worked to death matter to the Nazi government and its political leaders? They mattered just as much or just as little as any recognized form of simple decency or honor. As early as March 1940, Hess had circularized the political leaders with directives for behavior in case of landings of enemy planes or parachutists. You remember the order. Likewise, enemy parachutists are immediately to be arrested or made harmless. In view of less ambiguous orders which were to follow, and of the extraordinary precautions to maintain secrecy in respect of that order, can you now doubt what that somewhat ambiguous phrase was intended to convey? You remember it was to be disseminated orally to Kreisleiters, Ortsgruppenleiters, cell and blockleiters. Transmittal of the order by official orders, poster, press or radio was prohibited, and amongst their other precautions, it was declared to be a state secret document. Remember also that in addition to all the Hoheitsträgers being informed, the order went to the Reich Organization Directorate, the Reich Propaganda Directorate, and the Reich Student Leadership Office, which each had their own representative included in the Amtsleiter of the Gau, Kreis and Ortsgruppen staffs. It went also to the SS Gruppenführer Heydrich. In August 1943...
Mr. David, would that be a good time to break?
Hello, recording. Take a 10-minute break, a 10-minute...
In August 1943, Himmler instructed the police that it was not their task to interfere in clashes between Germans and terror flyers. Gauleiters were to be informed verbally. In May 1944, Goebbels was writing to the Völkischer Beobachter that it was not bearable to use German police to protect murderers. The next day, Bormann directed all Gauleiters, Verbandeführers, Kreisleiters and Ortsgruppenleiters that several instances had occurred in which aircraft crews who had bailed out who had made forced landings had been lynched on the spot by the incensed populace. I quote, "No police measures or criminal proceedings were involved against the German civilians who participated in these incidents," end quote. It was hardly necessary for us, in order to understand the purpose of that letter, to have captured a Gauleiter's order taking advantage of the invitation that Bormann had extended. In February 1945, the Gauleiter for Westfalen South expressly directed his Kreisleiters to encourage the lynching of Allied airmen. Fighter-bomber pilots, he wrote, who are shot down are in principle not to be protected against the indignation of the people. I expect from all police officers that they will refuse to lend their protection to these gangster types. You will have seen Gauleiter Hoffmann's evidence before your commissioners upon this matter. You will pay such attention to it as you think it deserves. Let me conclude this review of the evidence against the corps of political leaders by reminding you of the evidence of two witnesses called in defense of the organizations. One, Eberstein, whom you yourselves heard give evidence for the SS, and the other, Wahl, a Gauleiter who testified before your commissioners. You know the evidence that all the political leaders have given as to concentration camps, that they had nothing to do with them, that they knew nothing of what was happening inside them. But what did the witness Eberstein tell you? I quote from his evidence. In the beginning of March 1945, the Gauleiter and Reichsdefense-Kommissar Giesler in Munich ordered me to come to him and demanded that I should influence the commandant of Dachau to the effect that when the American troops approached, the prisoners, there were 25,000 people there at the time, were to be shot. I refused this demand with indignation, and I pointed out that I could not give any orders to the commandant. Whereupon Giesler said to me that he, as Reichsdefense-Kommissar, would see to it that the camp would be bombed by our own forces. I told him that I considered it impossible that any German Air Force commander would be willing to do this. Then Giesler said that he would see to it that something was put into the soup of the prisoners. That is, he threatened to poison them. From my own initiative, I sent an inquiry to the inspector of the concentration camps by teletype and asked for a decision from Himmler as to what was to be done with the prisoners in case the American troops approached. Shortly thereafter, the news came that the camps were to be surrendered to the enemy. I showed that to Giesler. He was quite indignant because I had frustrated his plans. And lastly, the witness Wahl, Gauleiter of Schwaben, gave this evidence. Question, witness, I was asking you about the conversation which you had with your wife on the question whether or not you should resign your position as Gauleiter. Isn't the implication to be drawn from that conversation this, that you were ashamed of what other Gauleiters were doing, and that all around you saw things going on which you disapproved and wanted to dissociate yourself from? Answer, yes. Question, that's true, isn't it? Answer, yes, that is true. And in answer to another question, he said, I want to stress the point that it is not my task and not my wish here to justify all the Gaus. In the Gauleiters, there were maniacs and bloodthirsty fools as everywhere else. I pass to the essay. Before dealing with the evidence against this organization, I'd say a word upon the question of voluntary membership. Counsel for the SA has argued that membership was not voluntary. It said that great pressure was brought to bear upon the German people to make them join one or other of the party organizations, and that in the case of certain sections of the SA, not only was pressure brought to bear upon membership, but membership was enforced by decree. On the evidence to which I shall draw your attention, you may well think that if, as in certain cases there undoubtedly was, pressure exerted upon individuals to join the party, and in some cases perhaps to join this particular organization, the consequences of refusal, as they have been pictured by the defense, are very much exaggerated. It's submitted that even if you accept without qualification the evidence of some of those witnesses as to particular cases of compulsion, the evidence which you have as to the organization as a whole is perfectly clear. The membership was from the first until the last voluntary. Never was there at any time compulsion recognizable in law as such, either physical or as a result of legal decrees. And then, my Lord, I have set out for the assistance of the tribunal the English law on compulsion. My Lord, I didn't intend to trouble the tribunal with it at the moment. It takes the rest of page 41 and page 42, and the leading cases are summarized in the footnote. So, my Lord, if I may continue at the top of page 43, let me shortly discuss the evidence upon this point. The General Service Regulations for the SA, published in 1933, laid it down that, I quote, he who cannot or will not subordinate himself is not suited to the SA and has to withdraw. The Organization Book of 1940 states, again I quote, service with the SA is and remains voluntary, As in recruitment for the SA, no advantages may be promised and no pressure whatever may be exercised. The SA man should have the possibility to withdraw. The witness Eugenics agreed with that statement as correct. He was asked, did it always remain a fundamental principle of the SA that membership should be voluntary? And answered, that was always the principle adhered to by the leadership. He was asked again, if a man no longer agreed with the SA views, was he expected to withdraw? And said, numerous men left the SA for a variety of reasons. By no stretch of the imagination can the evidence given in respect of the writer corps be said to constitute compulsion, physical or by decree. It is true that the original writing organizations were arbitrarily amalgamated into the SA, but as the witness Wahler called on behalf of this branch of the SA himself admitted, I quote, membership in the SA was voluntary in 1933, and this did not change. A man could resign from the writer corps, but he had to give up his sport inasmuch as the writing installations were no longer at his disposal. The Writers' Association, he said, submitted to the process of coordination because it enabled them to continue their athletic activity. You may think that it was during the years 1933 and 1934 that the activities of the SA were more obviously criminal to all the people of Germany than at any other time. How then can the loss of sporting activities constitute compulsion and afford an excuse for membership? Is the risk of the loss of a horse and stable to be regarded as legal justification for participation in murder? It should be remembered also that both in the case of the Writer Corps and the Stahlhelm, although those organizations may have been amalgamated with the SA by legal decree, there is no evidence before you that the decrees contained one word which might be construed as compulsion upon individual members to take up membership of the SA. The Stahlhelm is in much the same position as the Writer Corps, except that the evidence that Eugenics gave before the Commission is clearer still. Let me quote from the transcript of his evidence. Question, there was nothing, was there, to stop a member of the Stahlhelm withdrawing from the SA when the two organizations were combined in 1933? Answer, as far as I was concerned, in my district, no member of the Stahlhelm who did not desire to do so would have been compelled to join the SA. And that goes generally for the whole of Germany, does it not? It is reported that there were instances in which members of the Stahlhelm agreed to transfer only because it was ordered. But there is no instance where a man was forced to join
its own identity and its own leaders. You may find that it is in a somewhat special position when you are considering the criminal responsibility of the SA. It is, of course, open to the tribunal to give effect to that special position of the Writer Corps if it so desires. You remember that its membership totaled 200,000. Upon one further point which has been raised by the defense, I ought perhaps to say a word. It has been urged that the weekly paper, the SR Man, upon which the prosecution have drawn for a small part of their evidence against this organization, is inaccurate and does not truly represent either the policy or activities of the SA. You've heard the evidence for and against this proposition. I need only remind you that the paper was published by the official Nazi publishing house, the A Company, which published also Mein Kampf, the organization books, the orders and decrees.
Before you pass from the subject of numbers,
Yes, ma'am.
Does the figure which you gave of 2.5 million, allow for replacements?
No, my lord, the same would apply as to, with regard to replacements. We submit that it has to be borne, you have to bear against that the very heavy number of deaths which would occur during the years of the war. See, my lord, you've only got a period of 5 years up to the outbreak of the war. Lord, during that period, the 4.5 million was reduced to 1,500,000. After that, your replacements, we submit, would be offset by your deaths during the war.
Yes.
Lord, your Lordship will also appreciate that what we are trying to do
is to take the original figure, Euthanasia's original figure of 4.5 million. We submit that that's reduced at once to 2.5 million if you accede to our suggestion with regard to the Kyffhauser-Bund and the Kern-Stahlhelm alone. That would reduce it to 2.5 million. You've then got to take into account our suggested exclusion of the Stahlhelm members who left before the end of 1935. And then, of course, we leave the question of the Reiter Corps to the tribunal. But after you've done that, after you've arrived at a figure which may be somewhere about 2 million, the fact is that that figure was reduced in the 5 years by to 1,500,000, according to Euthanasia's evidence. My Lord, I was dealing with the essay man, and I continue. It carries under its title the description, the official organ of the Supreme Essay Leadership. Its editor, writing to the defendant Rosenberg, describes it without contradiction as the combat publication, an official organ of the Supreme Party leadership, with a circulation of 750,000. Lutzer himself recommends it in his annual training directive for 1939 as one of the official, I quote, aids to the preparation and carrying out of training. I submit to you that in the face of that evidence, the testimony of witnesses for the defense upon this matter ought not to be accepted. I invite you to consider the whole of the literature you have seen in connection with this organization. It is all the same, all about war, about lawless violence, about racial hatred. There is not one word on the ordinary matters of decent living, of the interests and activities and the ways of life of ordinary, decent, civilized, peaceful citizens. The things that generate great portions of the newspaper and literature of decent, law-abiding, peaceful countries. Compare the literature of the SA with that of any organization or society in any other country in Europe. The SA, the organization which prided itself upon its responsibility of educating and training the manhood of Germany, spoke only of militarism, of arrogance, of bullying and hatred. What need for this if their purpose was what they say? I turn to consider, very briefly, the evidence upon which we base our submission that this organization was criminal. The aims of the SA were the aims of the Nazi Party itself. Training in the SA is described in the organization book as, I quote, education training according to the doctrines and aims of the Führer as they are set forth in Mein Kampf and in the party program for all phases of our lives and our National Socialist ideology. Lutzer, chief of the SA, speaking to the diplomatic corps and foreign press in 1936, told them, when I state in the beginning that the obligations of the SA are those of the party and vice versa, I only mean that the SA considers the party's program as its own as well. The SA cannot be independent of the National Socialist movement, but can only exist as a part of it. In the framework of the party, the SA is its protective troops, its fighting shock troops, to which belong the most active members of the movement, politically speaking. The tasks of the SA are those of the party, and vice versa. They are therefore of an internal political nature. In the interests of time, I do not propose to dwell upon the evidence of how this organization performed its role as the protective troops and the fighting shock troops of the party. All this may well be said already to be a matter of historical fact. In the words of the indictment, the SA was developed by the Nazi conspirators before their accession to power into a vast private army and utilized for the purpose of creating disorder and terrorizing and eliminating opponents. It is said that the violent and criminal activity of its members, if indeed any such activity existed at all, was purely defensive, forced upon it in order to protect its members and their party leaders from the violence of the communist and other political parties. It is for you to judge the value of that evidence. In doing so, you will have in mind that all the documentary evidence upon this question which has been submitted to you in the defense document book is of Nazi origin and authorship. You may think that that description of the SA as a defensive organization is wholly inconsistent with the evidence you had from the witness Savering, from Gisevius, and in the affidavit you have had from the American consul Geist. My Lord, I set out part of the evidence. Again, I don't propose to read it to the tribunal today. I remind you of what Savering told you about the rowdy battalions and arrogance, and I ask the tribunal to look at the last word of the quotation at the top of page 52. Those were not ordinary little fights between political fighters during election fights. That was organized terror. The Stahlhelm witness Gruss confirmed that the evidence that Savering gave. I believe, he said, that on the whole Savering describes it correctly. It is my submission that the evidence of SA criminality during the years 1933 to 34, from the coming into power of the Nazi government until the Rome Purge, is well established and may be dealt with shortly. The same violence, the same disregard for the law and for the rights and privileges of all but themselves continued. It is sufficient to remind you of what Gisevius said. Again, my Lord, I remind you that that is the statement of Gisevius about the use of SA as auxiliary police, about private prisons, about arrests, and again, if I may quote the last sentence of that quotation, brawls could no longer be staged in the fight for power, yet the fight went on. Only the blows were now struck in the full enjoyment of power. Gisevius went on to describe in more detail the illegal arrests of political opponents by members of the SA, the prisons they established, and the treatment meted out in their victims. And he said it was the bestiality tolerated during the first months that later encouraged the sadistic murders in the concentration camps. Having heard Schaefer, first commandant of Oranienburg, cross-examined, have you the slightest doubt that atrocities were committed by SA men in that camp? You have the evidence of the witness Earl that the SA established a concentration camp at Wuppertal on the initiative of the local SA commander. At Hohenstein and at Bredau also, SA guards were torturing and murdering their prisoners. You remember the letter written in June 1935 from the Ministry of Justice to Hitler himself. In the camp, serious mistreatment of the prisoners has been going on at least since the summer of 1933. The prisoners were not only, as in the protective custody camp at Bredau near Stettin, beaten into a state of unconsciousness for no reason with whips and other tools, but were also tortured in other ways. Comment is unnecessary except to emphasize that sadism and illegal arrests of this kind were being practiced and carried out by SA men throughout the Reich. Within 6 weeks of the Nazis coming to power in January 1933, the German newspapers were quoting official sources for the statement that 18,000 communists had been imprisoned, while 10,000 prisoners in the jails of Prussia included many socialists and intellectuals. Zollmann, Social Democrat member of the Reichstag, was taken to the Brown House in Cologne to be tortured, beaten, and kicked for several hours. In Nuremberg, a man called Pfaumer was being beaten on the soles of his feet till he died. In Munich, the former editor of the newspaper, the Lower Bavarian Peasant, Dr. Elwar Schlegel, had his house wrecked and was himself ill-treated. These are only a few of the incidents of this kind which the Prime Minister of Bavaria describes when he says, I quote, "Of their total number throughout Germany, there can be no count." This was no political revolution. This was no self-protection from communist opposition. These men were the servants of the government, with the sure knowledge that all government agencies, the press, the law, and the police were under orders to condone and assist. They ran no risks. Their victims had no court or protection to which they could appeal. This was nothing but sheer sadism,
criminal brutality encouraged by the party and the SA leadership. You have the evidence of Geist, American consul. I personally can verify that the police had been instructed not to interfere. These officers told me that they and all the other police officers had received definite instructions not to interfere with the SA, the SS, or the Hitler Youth. Defendant Goering, speaking on 3rd March 1933, described the role that the SA were to perform from then on. He declared that the communists would be suppressed by the brown shirts. The police would not be used as in a bourgeois democracy. I quote, "I do not have to give justice. My aim is only to destroy and exterminate, nothing more. The struggle to the death, in which my fist will grasp your necks, I shall lead with those down there. Those are the brown shirts." Let me deal in rather greater detail with the activities of the SA during these years after 1934. It has been suggested that following the Rome purge, the SA diminished both in numbers and importance, and that the criminal activities of its members ceased. That its members were reduced is unquestionable. I've indicated the evidence of the reasons why. That it waned in importance is also true to the extent that official favor was bestowed more and more upon the SS for reasons that are well known. Nevertheless, the SA, both in the eyes of its own leaders, its members, and of the Nazi Party authorities, remained politically and militarily an important and vital force. By June 1934, the political opponents of the Nazi Party had been suppressed or incarcerated. Little wonder that we have less evidence of those incidents of mastery of the streets which filled the history of Germany during previous years. But the aims of the organization remained the same: fanatical support of the policy of the Nazi government. The suppression of such opposition has remained, particularly the churches and the Jews, and in addition, intensive preparation for aggressive war. Already the SA and the SS had been employed in the action to dissolve the trade unions. The Church and the Jews remained an ever-present problem. I've already referred to the Nazi Party's policy of suppression of all church influence, but I would remind you of the part the SA were playing in this fight during the years after 1934. You remember the incident in Freising Church in February 1935, when the Kreisleiterin instructed all her Nazi women to accompany SA stormtroopers to attend the service in Freising Church. It was SA men who arranged for the bell to ring during the cardinal's sermon. It was SA men who afterwards led Hans Heidel out into a field at night and beat him unmercifully for his resentment at the interference with the service, and I set out Hans Heidel's account of the story. Are you impressed with the defense that that was only an isolated incident? When you consider the evidence of wholesale and widespread acts of violence which had characterized the SA in the eyes of all Germany and the world during the years of Nazi struggle, the Reich Finance Ministry and the Reich Chancellery, the very heart of the Nazi government. The witness Freiherr von Waldenfels is another outstanding example of how a German who had the character to stand up for what he believed to be right could continue to do so without any dire results. Himself a civil servant and a leading member of the Stahlhelm in 1933, he resigned on its amalgamation with the SA, refused to join the SA, the party, or any other party organization, yet nevertheless continued to hold his position until the end of the war. Evidence has been given by the defense that university students were compelled by decree to become members of the SA. This contention has been supported by an order of the SA University Department in Munich, dated the 16th of April 1934, which is contained in the SA Defense Document Book. Upon that document I make two submissions. First, the reference to SA service does not connote membership of the SA, but a course of training under SA direction. Secondly, the sentence in paragraph 3, all newly matriculated students are therefore bound to join the SA, is not in accordance with the policy of the SA leadership and does not represent the practice in universities generally.
we have submitted to you another similar order issued by the SA University Department at Cologne 2 days before. When that order is read with the Munich order, it becomes apparent that this submission is well-founded. Paragraph 1 of both orders is identical. All students are to be, I quote, regimented by the SA University Department in order to be physically and mentally trained in a uniform manner in the spirit of the National Socialist Revolution, end quote. In paragraph 2, it is expressly stated that it is a matter of indifference whether they are members of the SA at all. Paragraph 3, while following the same form in both orders, differs essentially. In both cases, the orders are said to be based upon the same decree of the Supreme SA leadership of the 27th of March 1934. We've not seen that decree, but paragraph 3 of the Cologne order makes it clear that membership of the SA was not intended to be compulsory, as is suggested by the Munich order. It is evident also that the SA service with which both orders are concerned is something different and independent from membership of the organization. How can compulsory SA service mean compulsory SA membership when it is expressly stated that except during the 11 days from 25th April to 5th May, there is a ban on the enrollment of new members? The next words in both orders mark the essential difference between the two. In Munich, students are therefore bound to join the SA, while in Cologne they are, I quote, thereby offered the possibility of joining the SA, end quotation. If the SA service, which was to be compulsory for all German students, connoted membership of the SA, there could be no question of offering them the possibility of joining. You may think that in Munich, the heart of National Socialism, the decree of the Supreme SA leadership of 27th March was deliberately misinterpreted to suit the desire of a particularly fanatical Sturmführer. On the face of the documents, it is apparent that whatever was happening in Munich was not characteristic of every other university in Germany. Eugenics confirms the case for the prosecution. He states, I have already expressed that in some instances pressure has been exercised by organizations outside the SA. For instance, in the case of students and in the case of financing schools. But in answer to the question, there was nothing which compelled a student to join the SA if he disapproved of what the SA stood for. He said, I share that opinion. I add, the tribunal will observe that on the points in which I have quoted the evidence of Eugenics, there is corroboration in writing of that evidence. The fact is, as he explained, that where organizations are amalgamated with the SA, the vast majority of men were proud of the SA and proud to serve in the SA. If further evidence were wanted of the voluntary nature of this organization, both in theory and in practice, it is to be found in the steps which were taken by the SA leadership itself to reduce its members after the large influx that had taken place in 1933 and 1934, by the incorporation of such organizations as the Stahlhelm and Reiter Corps, and by the large number of candidates that flocked to every party organization after the Nazi seizure of power. From 4.5 million in 1934, the membership of the SA had dropped to 1,500,000 at the outbreak of war in 1939. Eugenics explained the causes of this reduction. It was due partly to the Bund, another old soldiers' organization, being excluded from the SA, but it was due also to the introduction of examinations for their members, failure to pass which resulted in dismissal, and to the fact that those who, I quote, for reasons of their occupation, were unable to do us a service and accordingly did not cheerfully continue to serve in the SA, end of quotation, were also dismissed. Such a weeding out and reduction in numbers from 4.5 to 1.5 million in 5 years is hardly compatible with the story of the whole of the German youth, the whole of the German civil service, and of the population generally being compelled to become members of the organization. It is submitted that this is conclusive evidence of the voluntary nature of this organization. How can it be maintained that all civil servants whose total number the witness Bowley gave as 3 million, 1 million Stahlhelm members, 100,000 students, 200,000 Reiter Corps members, and others besides, were all compelled to join the SA, when the total membership of that organization in 1939 was only 1,500,000. It may well be that upon a small, unwilling minority, pressure was brought to bear, that the consequences of refusal would have been serious. But this issue is to be decided upon recognized and established principles of law. Even were it not so, could we feel sympathy for these people? Did they show sympathy for the thousands of their fellow countrymen who were taken to the horrors of the concentration camps? Did they sympathize with the thousands of Jews who were slandered and persecuted unceasingly over the years? You will remember, however, that when certain questions in connection with the organizations were argued before you in February, I stated on behalf of the prosecution that we did not seek a declaration of criminality against certain sections of the SA. We excluded, 1, all wearers of the SA party badge who are not strictly members of the SA. 2, members of the SA Wehrmannschaften who were not otherwise members of the SA. You may well think, having heard the evidence that you have of the crimes committed by the Wehrmannschaften in Poland and in the Eastern Territories, that that branch of the SA ought not to be excluded. Nevertheless, we feel that many members of the units which were involved in these atrocities were also members of the SA proper, and we therefore respectfully submit that our original statement can properly stand. 3, members of the SA Reserve who had no time served in any other formation of the organization. 4, the National Socialist League for Disabled Veterans. It has been reiterated time and again that the prosecution are anxious to obtain a declaration of criminality only against those who bear a major responsibility for the crimes that have been committed. In view of this, and in view of the evidence that has been presented to you since February, we desire respectfully to recommend certain additional exclusions from among the general membership of the organization. First, the total strength of the SA in 1934 was given you by Eutner as 4.5 million. That figure included 1,500,000 members of the Kyffhauser Bund. Shortly after the amalgamation of that organization with the SA in 1933, the two were again separated. We respectfully recommend the exclusion of all those members of the Kyffhauser Bund who did not retain their membership of the SA after that separation. Secondly, we believe that we are also justified in asking for the exclusion of certain sections of the Stahlhelm. So that you may understand the grounds for this recommendation, it may be of assistance if I briefly remind you of the structure and history of that organization. It was composed of 1, the Scharnhorst, which was the Stahlhelm youth organization for boys under 14, with a strength of about 500,000. 2, the Wehr Stahlhelm, which included the Jung Stahlhelm, boys from 14 to 24, and the Stahlhelm Sports Formation, men from 24 to 35. The total strength of the Wehr Stahlhelm was 500,000. The Kern Stahlhelm, 3, the Kern Stahlhelm, which consisted of men between 36 and 45 years of age, its strength has been given as 450,000. The total strength of the Stahlhelm was therefore approximately 1.5 million men and boys. In 1933, the Stahlhelm was placed under the control of the Nazi Party. The Scharnhorst was transferred to the Hitler Jugend, the Wehr Stahlhelm to the SA proper, and the Kern Stahlhelm to the SA Reserve. Since we have already excluded the SA Reserve, we are left to consider only that part of the Stahlhelm which was incorporated into the SA proper, 500,000 members of the Wehr Stahlhelm. You have evidence both from witnesses and from documents contained in the defense document book that many of these 500,000 Stahlhelm members were opposed to their transfer to the SA and to the policies and aims of the SA and the Nazi Party. Many, including the witness von Waldenfels, refused to join the SA. It is a possible hypothesis that many more, although opposed to the policies of the SA, were prepared to join in view of the assurance that was given to them
that they would retain their independent character, identity, and leaders in the same way as did the Writer Corps, and that they would never be called actively to associate themselves with the SA proper. On the other hand, there can be no doubt whatsoever that many wholeheartedly joined the SA and participated to the fullest extent in its criminal activities. Eugenics himself is an example, and he declared that he was by no means alone. You'll remember his evidence. Numerous SA men came to me in the first few months who had formerly belonged to the Stahlhelm. Like myself, they felt regret that their fine old organization was no longer in existence. But together with me, they hailed the fact that they were now permitted to participate in this large community of the SA. Speaking of his own district, he said, really, after 1933, the nucleus of the SA was my old steel helmet organization. Therefore, many steel helmet men remained in the SA. To exclude the whole of the Stahlhelm would entail the exclusion of men like Eugenics and many other Stahlhelm members who were to form the nucleus of the SA. We believe that a just and practical distinction may be drawn between these two classes. In July and August of 1935, the assurance which had been held out to the Stahlhelm that they would retain their independent status side by side with their membership of the SA was broken. The organization of the Stahlhelm was finally dissolved. Their uniforms, their meetings, and all their previous activities were prohibited. From that time, the Stahlhelm members who remained in the SA were indistinguishable from the rest of the body. They had joined the SA in 1933, knowing, as one of their witnesses has declared, the criminal nature and policies and activities of the SA. Now in 1935, they would have had no illusion that by remaining members, they would be expected to support that policy and participate in these activities. None who remain members after that date can absolve themselves from a major responsibility for the crimes committed by the SA and by the Nazi government, of which the SA was one of the essential bulwarks. We therefore respectfully recommend for your consideration whether all those members of the Stahlhelm who resigned or were ejected from the SA prior to 31st December 1935 might also be excluded. We submit that those who remain are rightly included in the criminal organization of the SA. You will appreciate the effect of these exclusions on the number of SA members involved in these proceedings. The exclusion of the 1,500,000 Kyffhauser-Bund and the 500,000 Kernstahlhelm alone reduces Eugenics' total to 2.5 million, and that takes no account of the other exclusions which the prosecution have suggested. Lastly, I would say a word about the Writer Corps. I have already submitted that there is no legal basis for suggesting that their membership was involuntary. The prosecution recognizes, however, that insofar as the Writer Corps retained its separate organizations of riding clubs,
can you doubt that similar incidents were taking place throughout Germany in 1935 and afterwards, whenever the occasion presented itself? Does the very nature of an organization such as this change within a few months? If the nature and aims of the SA had changed, why should the SR Mann have been publishing articles in 1937 and 1938 decrying the church with such titles as My Dear Franciscans, The Black Balance, Political Catholicism, The Church Wants to Dictate to the State, Unmasked Political Catholicism, and finally, Does the Vatican Want War? If the violent manners of the SA had been converted during these years, why should the official organ of its supreme leadership have been recounting stories of its early battles? Their titles tell the tale: We Subdue the Red Terror, Nightly Street Battles on the Czech Border, The SA Breaks the Red Terror, Bloody Sunday in Berlin, and that description of the 9th of November 1923 in Nuremberg, when during the course of the disturbances someone shouted, "The Jewish place will be stormed, out with the Jews." The part the SA played in the ever-increasing persecution of the Jews dissolves any doubt that may be of the continuing criminality of the organization during the years after 1934. Of the boycott in April 1933, Goebbels had written in his biography, 1st April 1933, all Jewish stores are closed. At their entrances, SA sentries are standing. It was only an example of how throughout all Germany, the SA provided the Nazi government with a means of putting its policy into effect. The instructions issued by the defendant Streicher and his committee had directed the SA and SS are instructed to warn the population by means of pickets from entering Jewish enterprises once the boycott has started. You have the evidence of Kurt Schmidt, Minister of Economics and member of the Reich Cabinet until January 1935. I quote, "I have to say that the SA gained a more and more disastrous influence as a destructive element in economic and Jewish matters." You have the evidence of their own witness, Freiherr von Waldenfels, who was asked, did the SA take an active part in the persecution of the Jews after 1934? And answered, as far as I have been told stories, yes. I myself saw the looting of shops in Munich, but whether that was done by order or whether it originated with individuals, I cannot say. He tried to minimize the significance of the SA after 1934, but his evidence was quite clear. Question, in their less important role, did they continue the policy and practice that they had been carrying out before the persecution of the Jews? Answer, there is no doubt. Goebbels, speaking to the SA in October 1935, reminded them that they were the strongest strong arm of the movement and that the Nazi government was an anti-Jewish government. If the active persecution of the Jews was not a continuing role of the SA after 1934, why should Lutzer, Chief of Staff of the SA, speaking to the diplomatic corps and deputies of the foreign press in January 1936, have had to explain away the title with which the foreign press so often branded the SA, the bearer of a barbaric and uncivilized race struggle? Why should all these articles have been appearing in the SR Man almost monthly during the years 1935 to 39, in wording so similar to that favored by der Stürmer? The titles are sufficient to indicate their nature, and I only draw attention to 4. Murder, the Jewish slogan. Grave diggers of world culture. Jewish world revolution, out of the USA. Friends of world jury, Roosevelt and Nichols. And if the members of the SA were not in fact continuously and actively persecuting the Jews after 1934, how is it possible to account for the fact that the part they played in the demonstrations of November 1938? You will remember the instructions received by the SA 50th Brigade in Darmstadt in the early morning of the 10th of November. By order of the Gruppenführer, I am quoting, all the Jewish synagogues within the 50th Brigade are to be blown up or set on fire immediately. The action is to be carried out in civilian clothes. Then, my Lord, I give some further details, and I ask your Lordships to leave the next paragraph and go on to the last paragraph on that page, where I say, those events in the Mannheim district cannot have been, as the defense would have you believe, an exception to the policy of the SA leadership and to the general behavior of SA members in the rest of Germany. According to Heydrich's report, altogether 267 synagogues were destroyed that night. We can properly ask, why should the 50th, 51st and 151st Brigades alone have received instructions to destroy 11 synagogues? Why should Eutner himself have issued to all SA units the orders from Hesse that all officers of the party and its branches which had safeguarded valuable property were to hand it over to the nearest office of the Gestapo? We ask you to say that that evidence is in itself conclusive. Nevertheless, you have in addition the report of the proceedings of the Supreme Party Court in connection with the murders of Jews which took place during those demonstrations. 15 SA men committed murder. They did so all over Germany, in East Prussia, in Dessau, in Hanover, in Bremen, in Saxony, and in Munich. Were they too all isolated incidents? Goering's biographer wrote of the SA in 1937. In 1937, the present reorganization of the security police is hardly noticed by the public. Their ranks are strengthened by the SA, the most reliable instrument of the movement. Hardly could any organization have received a more damning testimonial. I pass to the preparations for war and wartime activities. Immediately the Nazi Party came to power, the SA became the embryo army with which the Nazis commenced their preparations for aggressive war. Geist, the American consul, tells you, particularly through the years 1933 and 1934, hordes of stormtroopers, SA, were much in evidence practicing military exercises. They were being converted into a military organization. I frequently encountered the stormtroopers deployed in fields and forests engaged in military technical exercises. This was all part of a general plan to prepare Germany's manpower for war. Geist's assumption is confirmed by Lutzer himself, writing in 1939. But already in 1920, by the founding of the SA, the Führer established the extensive mission of this SA. The SA shall be the bearer of the military thought of a free people. In the same sense, the Führer said in his book, Mein Kampf, give the German nation 6 million perfectly trained bodies in sport, all fanatically inspired with the love of the fatherland, and trained to the highest intensive spirit, and a national socialist state will, if necessary, have created an army out of them in less than 2 years. The men never forget the mission of the Führer to require the military training of the German men and to reconstruct the military spirit of the German people. What use is it for SA witnesses to come now and tell this tribunal that the SA did not have any military character and did not desire to have it? Or that the SA always preserved the non-military character of its training program? There is abundant other evidence of the military character and purpose of the SA and of its intensive training and preparation for war. Dr. Ernst Baer, writing on the orders of the Supreme SA headquarters in 1938, yet again describes the aims of the SA. The SA was commissioned to obtain an increase and preservation of a warlike power and a warlike spirit as the expression of an aggressive attitude. As early as May 1933, von Reichenau suggested that the Supreme Command of the SA should be represented on the Reich Defense Council. I add, you will remember Röhm's penciled note showing that this had already been done. A regular officer was appointed to the SA to assist them in military training. For the purpose of camouflage, he was to wear SA uniform. I quote, we know the form which the training took from 1933 until 1939, from the training directives and other documents, some issued by Lutzer himself, shooting, grenade throwing, judging distance, map reading, and marching. We also know that as early as July 1933, the SA had formed specialized units such as signal and motorized companies and separate air wings. The SA command was anxiously stressing the need for secrecy in the case of any publications, I quote, which might give other countries an opening to construe German infringements of the terms of the Versailles Treaty. The publication of pictures enabling other countries to prove the alleged formation of technical troop units was forbidden. It is hardly necessary, again to quote Dr. Ernest Baer, to see the purpose of these technical units. But I quote him, there originates in these technical units of the SA a trained crew whose capabilities and knowledge are not the last things of extraordinary value
in the service for defense of the country. Similarly, he wrote of the Reiter Corps. At present, the SA each year is able to furnish many thousands of young trained cavalrymen to our Wehrmacht. Can we doubt that every member of the SA knew to what end all this was leading, when the Chief of Staff himself was saying publicly that the training principle of the SA was always the spiritual, moral, and physical culture of militarization of the whole German nation? In March 1934, permanent liaison had been established between the SA and the Reich Defense Ministry in connection with all A tasks. Eugenics has explained what these A tasks were: training and border protection. Did border protection mean preparations for the military seizure of the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia? In that same month of 1934, the SA were in fact forming in the Rhineland an armed staff.
In Czechoslovakia, the SA provided the chief support for the Sudeten Free Corps. In October 1938, a few weeks after the Munich crisis, the OKW liaison officer with the Free Corps reported supplies had been organized by the SA, arms supplied by the Austrian SA. With magnificent camaraderie and unselfishness, the SA leadership had looked after the Free Corps materially. Equipping and feeding remained in the care of the NSDAP and the SA. And, my Lord, I add to remind the tribunal that in the appendix to that document there will be found a list of the prisoners, the booty taken by the Free Corps, and the casualties inflicted by them in what was a time of peace. This support to the Free Corps was certainly included in border control, as Eugenics himself admitted. The crimes of the SA did not end with the outbreak of war. Again, I quote from the witness Eugenics: "At the beginning of the war with Poland, the SA group Sudeten carried out transports of prisoners of war into the camp. Other SA groups in the east may have been used for similar purposes. Later on, the SA leadership and the SA as an organization had nothing to do with this question. When you consider the evidence you have heard of the appalling conditions in which these prisoners from the east were transported into their camps, are you satisfied that the task of guarding transports was as innocent as it appears?" Eugenics has also left us a report dated June 1941 describing the activity of the SA in the war. In the communicating zones, its members gave assistance to the political leaders in their tasks of education and orientation. 21 groups of SA men were being used for guarding prisoners. The organization of the SA groups in Danzig, Posen, Silesia, and the Baltic provinces is described in these words: "In these regions, also as in combat, the SA was the assault unit of the party. In these regions also, the SA service, practically speaking, is directed towards strengthening the defensive forces. It was therefore necessary to overcome the inferiority complexes of the racial Germans, the result of Polish suppression, and to bring their extraordinary appearance and bearing into keeping with SA standards." How sinister these innocent words become in view of all the evidence of what was taking place in these eastern and Baltic provinces. The administration of the ghetto of Vilna was in the hands of the SA, and its inmates were guarded by SA guards. Some of these Jews were made to live enchained in deep pits, where the SA fastened chains round their ankles and round the waist. They weighed 2 kilos each, and we could only take small steps when wearing them. We wore them permanently for 6 months. The SA said that if any man removed the chains, he would be hanged. Their work consisted of digging up mass graves. We dug up altogether 68,000 bodies. Amongst those I dug up, I found my own brother. At Vilna, too, SA guards were forcing the Jews to extract the gold from the teeth of their dead brothers with prongs, washing it in benzene and packing it into 8-kilogram boxes, which the SA officer in charge personally took away. The ghetto of Shaolin
Herr Präsident, ich glaube, dass sich diese Ausführungen, die eben gemacht worden sind, auf ein Affidavit beziehen, D 964, das das Gericht vorzulegen bzw. vorlegen dürfen zu dürfen durch die Anklage abgelehnt hat. Das ist das Affidavit GB 597. Und nun ist diese ganze eidesstattliche Versicherung hier auf Seite 64 abgedruckt, wiedergegeben. Und der Inhalt der Ausführungen, wie sie eben gemacht worden sind, ist aus dieser eidesstattlichen Versicherung entnommen, die vorzulegen nicht genehmigt ist.
Lord, I respectfully disagree with Dr. Böhm. I have the affidavit in front of me, D964, which has the exhibit number GB597. Paragraph 7 reads, "Our work consisted in digging up mass graves and piling the bodies onto funeral pyres and burning them."
Yes, but Sir David, what Dr. Böhm is saying is that we rejected the affidavit.
No, my Lord, not this affidavit. I distinctly remember reading it. My Lord, and it's got an exhibit number. I selected one affidavit dealing with each town. And my Lord, this one of Saloma Gaul was the affidavit I selected with regard to Vilna.
Dr. Böhm, what ground have you got for saying that it was rejected? If it was rejected, you must have some reason for, if you think... Where are the transcript? You've got the transcript, I suppose?
Ich bin der Auffassung, dass diese eidesstattliche Versicherung zu den eidesstattlichen Versicherungen gehören, die das Gericht vorzulegen abgelehnt hat. Ich kann das momentan natürlich nicht nachprüfen, aber ich will das gern nach der Sitzung dann tun, mich davon überzeugen, ob das richtig ist. Ich glaube, dass diese eidesstattliche Versicherung zu den Affidavits gehört, die vorzulegen abgelehnt worden sind wegen des Abschlusses der Beweisaufnahme.
This wasn't one of the 11 affidavits.
Oh, no, my Lord. The Lordship will remember that I had about half a dozen Jewish witnesses from the Baltic provinces, and the tribunal said that I could call 3 and that they were to be available for cross-examination by Dr. Böhm. The deponent of this affidavit, Zloma Gol, was one of the 3 that I selected, and I put in this affidavit, which received the exhibit number GB597. My Lord, that is the recollection of myself, of Colonel Griffith Jones and Major Barrington, who were helping me at the time. And the fact that it has an exhibit number is a prima facie evidence that the court tribunal accepted it.
Well, I think you'd better go on. If Dr. Böhm can produce evidence that it was rejected, it will be struck out of your speech, it will be disregarded.
The ghetto of Shaolin, south of Riga, was in charge of the SA. 700 to 800 men were there, recognizable by their brown uniform and swastika armlets. In August 1941, the SA surrounded the whole ghetto, and members of them went into the houses and took out children and old men and put them into lorries and drove them away. I saw all this myself. It was done exclusively by SA. I saw them take children by the hair and throw them into the lorries. I did not see what happened to them, but a Lithuanian told me afterwards that they had been driven 20 kilometers away and shot. He said he had seen the SA make them undress and shoot them with automatic pistols. The SA guarded the ghetto of Kaunas, where 10,500 Jews were shot in the dreadful action of the 28th October 1941. So also did they guard the labor camps of Sakrau, Mechtal, Markstedt, Klettendorf, Liebelau, Faulbruck, Reichenbach, and Annaberg in Upper Silesia, where Poles, Frenchmen, Belgians, Dutch, and Greeks slaved and died through ill treatment and malnutrition, and where the methods of the SA by no means lagged behind those of the SS. There can be no doubt of the veracity of those Jews who underwent these years of nightmare in the ghettos and labor camps in the East. Not only are the conditions they describe confirmed again and again from other sources and from the Germans' own documents, but even the identification of a particular SA man they mention is corroborated. Lieb Kebart gave you the name of the district commissioner in whose courtyard the Jews from the Schaulen ghetto were daily cursed and beaten by their SA guards. He told you he was called Gewecker and that he was a member of the SA. We have the signature of Gewecker on one of his own letters, dated the 8th of September 1941, complaining that the SS were interfering in his arrangements with the orderly confiscation of Jewish property. The letter heading on that document is the Regional Commissar in Schaulen. Nor was it only in guarding duties that the SA were employed. They were forming Einsatzkommandos of their own, and units of the SA were sharing in the bloody work of annihilating the partisans. The regional commander of the security police and SD in Krakow, in writing to the defendant Frank, tells of the work of a special SA Einsatzkommando, which was formed for the purpose of collecting workers from the civilian population. The General Commissar for White Ruthenia reported in June 1943 that by order of the Chief of Bern Combating, SS Obergruppenführer von dem Bach, units of the Wehrmannschaften have also participated in the operation. SA Standartenführer Koma was in command of the Wehrmannschaften. That action, to which the General Commissar referred, was the terrible Operation Cottbus, which you will remember, and of which the General Commissar reported. The political effect upon the peaceful population is simply dreadful in view of the many shootings of women and children. The SA had been organized in the Government General in 1941. Speaking in December 1943, the defendant Frank said, "When 2.5 years ago I gave orders for the SA to be formed, I was guided by a thought which today fills me more emphatically than ever. I strove to ensure that an emergency reserve of absolutely unshakable National Socialists should, under all circumstances, exist in the Government General. It is quite clear that this emergency reserve of pronounced National Socialist fighters can only be the SA. Here, as an SA comrade with my SA comrades, I can, within the framework of the SA, truly cultivate what has to do with the folk in a way which I cannot do in the political existence of the area, where I have to take numerous things into account and have to have a whip in my hand without interruption, like a lion tamer in a lion's cage, in order to keep the bandits in check. That is a point of view which a Gauleiter in the Reich never need take into account. It, the SA, has for the first time been employed here in a new area with new methods and tasks, which, however, have been solved owing to the very fact that the SA is here, the same as it was in the period of struggle in the Reich. Meanwhile, at home in the Reich, the SA were taking over, I quote, the functions which had previously been entrusted only to the SS and SIPO and Army, for instance, the guarding of prisoner of war camps, supervision of forced laborers in Germany and occupied territories. This cooperation of the SA was planned and arranged by high officers in Berlin as early as the middle of 1943. In Styria, the camp of Frauenberg was being operated as a labor camp for habitual drunkards, delinquents, and shirkers. 300 inmates worked in the neighboring stone quarries and on road construction. SA men provided the guards. We can picture the conditions in which these shirkers
and delinquents lived or died. Violence and murder and mastery of the streets during the years of struggle. Illegal arrest, unauthorized concentration camps, unbelievable sadism during the years of triumph, 1933 and 1934. Ruthless suppression and brutal persecution of Jews and Christians and of every opposition, coupled with warlike and aggressive training during the years from 1934 until the outbreak of war. And after that, more concentration camps, more sadism, more suppression and persecution, this time of the allegedly racial inferior peoples they had conquered, and violence and murder, but not, as it had been in the distant days of 1923, of individuals. Now it was of whole peoples. It is the same pattern running through the years. Can your decision frank these men again to terrorize the peoples of Germany and Europe? You are already too well aware of the character of this organization and of the activities of its members. The letters SS appear in connection with almost every one of the crimes, great and small, of which you have now heard daily over the course of almost 10 months. It may all be summarized, even if understated, in the words of their leader Himmler. I quote, "I know there are some people in Germany who become sick when they see these black coats. We understand the reason and do not expect that we shall be loved by too many. I would therefore address you only upon one or two particular points that have arisen and to which the prosecution attached particular importance. The history of the development of the SS may be stated in a few words. Created originally as an elite bodyguard for the protection of Hitler himself, together with the SA, it formed a private Nazi army and the basis of what was to become the vital instrument in the conspiracy to wage aggressive war. Its value as a thoroughly reliable instrument of the Führer was demonstrated in June 1934, when it performed the function of executioner in the blood purge which accompanied the murder of the SA leader Röhm. I quote, "It appalled everyone," said Himmler later, "and yet everyone was certain that he would do it again if such orders were issued and if it were necessary." The willingness of the SS to do it again was to be exemplified a millionfold in the ensuing years. Until January 1933, the SS consisted of a single unit. There were no special branches, and apart from their common role with the SA and their special position as Hitler's bodyguard, they had no other particular tasks. After the Nazi Party had come to power, however, and particularly after 1934, its members increased and its organization expanded and became more complex. New units were created, such as the SS Totenkopf Verbände, the task of which was and continued to be the guarding of concentration camps. A few selected units were given arms and in effect became Himmler's private army, known as the SS Verfügungstruppe. At the same time, certain functions became the specialty of other groups, which, while not having a separate organizational status, came to be designated as separate branches. For instance, the SD, who were the intelligence service of the SS, and who were later to work in such close cooperation with the Gestapo. Although it became customary to distinguish between the several branches and formations of the SS by name, in terms of administration and command, there were parts of the one SS, all under command of the Reichsführer SS, and all administered and controlled through the various main offices of the SS Supreme Command. At the outbreak of war, the majority of the Allgemeine SS, the great mass of the SS membership which had remained unarmed, were drafted into the Wehrmacht. New recruits were enrolled in the Verfügungstruppe, which was expanded to form the fighting divisions of the SS. And it was these fighting divisions which in about 1940
came to be known as the Waffen-SS. The tribunal has seen from the report of the SS Statistical Institute how the SS had developed by 30th June 1944. By then it had a total membership of 794,941. The Allgemeine SS, the original nucleus of the SS, had declined in importance during the war because more than half of its 200,000 members had been called up to the Wehrmacht, the labor service, or other special Nazi agencies. The remaining 594,000 belonged to the Waffen-SS. The tribunal has seen how 368,000 of the Waffen-SS were in field units. About 160,000 were in reinforcement, training, and reserve units. 26,544 were in other units and offices directly subordinate to the operational headquarters of the SS High Command. 39,415 were in the SS main offices. It is particularly significant to see how these 39,000 men of the Waffen-SS were distributed. The tribunal will see I've attached a table. Witnesses have told you that the Waffen-SS had nothing to do with the concentration camps, but no less than 24,000 of them were in the WVHA, the offices which organized and were responsible for the administration and personnel of the concentration camps. That 24,000 did not include the Totenkopf SS, which provided the guards. Waffen-SS men also provided the manpower of the various Nazi genocide organizations operating within and on behalf of the SS, the Racial and Settlement Main Office, the Office of the Reich Kommissar for the Consolidation of German Folkdom, the Central Office for Persons of German Race, the personal staff of Hitler, including Siever's infamous Ahnenerbe. It is said of the Waffen-SS that it was in effect a purely military organization, the character of which was no different from any unit of the Wehrmacht. On the evidence, this is not so. It is true that the Waffen-SS was the combat arm of the SS, but although its fighting formations came under command of the army for operational purposes, always they remained an integral part of the SS. Indeed, the Hitler order regarding the function of the SS on mobilization provided that if placed under the command of the army, it, I quote, remains a unit of the NSDAP politically. Recruiting, training, promotions, administration, and supply of the Waffen-SS throughout the war remained the function of the Supreme Command of the SS. It was recruited through the SS main office. It was organized, administered, and supplied through the SS Operational Office, which was the seat of its command headquarters. Members of the Waffen-SS were subject to jurisdiction by the SS main legal office. Like all other formations of the SS, the Waffen-SS was subject to Himmler's jurisdiction as Reichsführer SS. It was in theory and in practice as much an integral part of the SS organization as any other branch of the SS. You will remember the evidence that von Rundstedt gave. I quote, "The troop units of the SS were subordinate only to Himmler. I had no disciplinary power or judicial power over them. I could not give them leaves or issue awards. I was responsible only for the technical employment of those divisions, much as I might use an Italian, Hungarian, or Slovakian division." These then were the broad outlines of the SS, this all-purposeful state within the state, as General Detzel called it. The defense now seeks to divide this all-embracing unity of the SS into various totally separate components, united only in the person of Himmler. He and 3 or 4 of his subordinates are alone made responsible for the millionfold crimes that were committed. But this contention violates both truth and sense. We are dealing in this trial not with the murder of 10 men here or 20 there,
In this indictment is charged not only the murder of millions, but a demoniac plan of genocide, of the planned murder of whole nations, peoples, and races. The SS was the chosen instrument for this plan, which out-Heroded Herod. This plan could only be executed by the use of the whole of the SS, of every branch of the SS working in unison and in cooperation with each other. The evidence given in this trial has shown that the crimes of the Nazi conspirators could not have been executed in an improvised way by sporadic criminal acts. They were carefully planned, prepared, and put into action through the SS and other criminal organizations. The men of the SS were particularly qualified for this plan of crime. Physically trained and selected, they were politically indoctrinated in Nazism and were committed to blind obedience to the commands of Hitler and Himmler and the rest of the Nazi leaders. Orders must be sacred, said Himmler. Not only was membership voluntary during the first 16 years of the existence of the SS from 1925 on, it was subject to most careful selection in an endeavor to produce what the SS called a male racial elite, a superstratum, a band of definitely Nordic German men. SS men had to be fanatical Nazis of Aryan descent. Much emphasis has been made by the defense that during the course of the war, the voluntary basis of the recruitment was replaced by compulsory drafting. The witness Brill gave evidence that at the end of the war, there were more draftees in the Waffen-SS than volunteers. It may be helpful to the tribunal if I very shortly discuss the evidence of that witness. While it is not questioned that at some stage during the war, considerable numbers of men were arbitrarily drafted into the Waffen-SS, the date when this practice commenced and the extent to which it was carried, as they have been given by the witness Brill, are both challenged. He told you that the first 36,000 were conscripted between the autumn of 1939 and the spring of 1940. To say that the 36,000 were compulsorily drafted into the SS is deliberately misleading. When he was cross-examined before the commissioner upon a similar statement, he admitted that 36,000 were already members of the Allgemeine SS, which they had voluntarily joined. They were not conscripted. They were simply posted from one part of the SS to another. Figures of the subsequent conscripts which he gave were as follows. During 1942, 30,000, 43, 100,000, 44, 210,000, making a total of 340,000. Even on those figures, he is far short of justifying his statement that by the end of the war there were more conscripts than volunteers. He gave the grand total of the Waffen-SS as 910,000, a figure which included its strength in 1940 and all subsequent reinforcements, both voluntary and compulsory. 340,000 amounts to only just over 1/3 of their total. On the question of the date at which recruits were first conscripted into the SS, there is considerable evidence to refute this witness. In February 1940, Hess was instructing the party officers to assist in the voluntary recruitment for the SS. In the decrees which he issued, there was no suggestion of compulsory drafting. In April 1942, a recruiting pamphlet was emphasizing the voluntary basis of the Waffen-SS in these words, I quote, "The youth of the National Socialist Reich knows that he must himself initiate proceedings in order to complete his military service in the Waffen-SS. That so many young Germans have volunteered for the Waffen-SS is a living testimonial to the confidence of today's young generation in the Waffen-SS, its spirit, and above all, its leadership." The Soldier's Friend, a pocket diary for the German armed forces, published in 1943, the year in which Brill would have you believe that 100,000 men were conscripted without choice, was describing the members of the SS as hopeful young men who had voluntarily decided to join the ranks of the Waffen-SS. It stated, I quote, "Everyone has acquainted himself with the comprehensive manual for the Waffen-SS. The principal points are as follows. 1. Service in the armed forces, SS, counts as military service. Only volunteers are accepted. In the April of the same year, Himmler was directing the defendant Kaltenbrunner on the admission of SIPO officials into the SS. I wish to clarify again, he said, I want an admission only if the following conditions are fulfilled. 1, if the man applies freely and voluntarily. And the organization book for 1943 explains that the Waffen-SS, by admitting volunteers for the duration of the war, makes it possible for those volunteers to fight in the battle for the evolution of the National Socialist idea. I'm entitled also to make this comment on Brill's evidence. You'll remember that I've already referred you to the statements which this witness made upon the activities of the SS Division Liebstandarte, which must, in my respectful submission, be regarded as perjured testimony. In view of the suspect nature of his evidence, and the evidence there is to contradict it, it is my submission that whatever may have been the extent of compulsory service in the SS, it was very much less and came into being at a very much later date than he contends. But whatever the truth of this matter may be, it is our submission that the fact that a number of men were compulsory enrolled ought not and cannot afford this organization a defense. The instances of crime committed by the SS during the war are so widespread, so constant and so vast, that you are compelled to infer that the vast majority of its members, whether in the first place they joined voluntarily or otherwise, readily accepted the tradition of the SS and themselves became willing parties to its criminal activities. May I consider in outline only
some of the evidence upon which that conclusion must be drawn. You know already the form of education and training that the SS men received, a training for the racial struggle, which Himmler commanded them to prosecute without mercy. Racial theories, geopolitics, eugenics, that was their curriculum. Mein Kampf was their Bible. Their basic philosophy was expressed by Himmler. It must be a matter of course that the most copious breeding should be from this racial superstratum of the Germanic people. In 20 to 30 years, we must really be able to present the whole of Europe with its leading class. If the SS, together with the farmers, then run the colony in the East on a grand scale, without any restraint, without any question about any kind of tradition, but with nerve and revolutionary impetus, we shall in 20 years push the national boundary 500 kilometers eastward. The propagation of ideas like these could only have accustomed SS men to the conception of a world in which the destruction, enslavement, and the degradation of inferior peoples were regarded as an honorable duty. Pangs of conscience did not and could not trouble these men. The tribunal will remember the words of Bach-Zelewski when he was asked whether the murder of 90,000 Jews by one small Einsatz group, to which incidentally the Waffen-SS provided most of the killers, was in keeping with Nazi philosophy. He said, I am of the opinion that when for years, for decades, the doctrine is preached that the Slav race is an inferior race and Jews not even human, then such an outcome is inevitable. Not only were SS generals like Bach-Zelewski and Ohlendorf themselves infected by this poison, it is our submission that it did and must have poisoned the ordinary SS men who did the killing. Their extermination of Jews was regarded as, I quote, a page of honor in our history. Honor, cold-blooded mass murder regarded as honor. Do we need further evidence to prove the type of men this filthy education bred? Long before they had enrolled themselves in the SS, their members had been saturated with racial hatred and Führer worship. SS training was only a more advanced course. When they joined the SS, to whatever part they went, they saw the practical application of all they had learned before. Everywhere, in every office, in every unit, murder was the trade. And wherever murder was to be done, it was the members of the SS that were enrolled to do it. The Ahnenerbe was a department of the SS. Its list of members included the names of over 100 professors and other educated men, all SS members who relied upon the murderous business of hundreds of other SS members to supply them with the bodies for their experiments and the specimens for their collections. Bodies of commissars who were to be taken alive and then decapitated, care being taken, I quote, that the head should not be damaged. Professor Hirt wrote, by procuring the skulls of the Jewish Bolshevik commissars who represent the prototype of the repulsive but characteristic subhuman, we have the chance now to obtain a scientific document. The Office for the Consolidation of German Folkdom was an office of the SS. The office responsible for the awful crime of genocide and all that it entailed. The RSHA and the WVHA, controlling and responsible for the concentration camps, were manned by SS. The crimes of the SS in the concentration camps need no further mention except to emphasize that the inquiries instituted by the SS judicial system, of which the witness Morgan gave evidence, were not inquiries into mass murder, but into cases of corruption by SS officials. That witness is another whom I have already suggested to be unworthy of belief. How can the story of an investigation by an SS judge into the murders by Hirsch at Auschwitz, which were interrupted by the advance of the Allies, be taken seriously? What further investigation could have been needed when Morgan himself knew all the details of the Auschwitz killings sometime in 1943 or 1944? Do you doubt that had the Allies lost the war, Hirsch would still be committing mass murder in that concentration camp, and that SS judges would still be investigating corruption and isolated crimes? The Einsatz commanders were primarily SS. They show in miniature the cooperation between the various branches of Himmler's system and the unity of the whole SS. Action Group A was composed as follows: Waffen-SS 34.4%, SD 3.5%, Criminal Police 4.1%, Gestapo 9%, Auxiliary Police 8.8%, other police 13.4%. The system of exterminating Jewry was handled by SS. The Warsaw Ghetto is but one example. The deportation, murder and robbery of the Poles and other peoples occupying territory which was required for German settlement was undertaken by SS. You will remember the Globoknik report, the action in which thousands of Poles were removed from their homes and 178 million Reichsmarks acquired for the WVHA, in which, in the words of Globoknik himself, was, I quote, carried out within the framework of the SS. Only the decency and honesty, as well as the surveillance of the SS men used for this purpose, could guarantee a complete delivery. One is surprised that he did not add, pecunia non olet, the money does not smell. The Waffen-SS came to be the spearhead of Nazi wars of aggression, particularly in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and exemplified the tyranny and slaughter which were inherent in Nazi domination. I quote, "We will never let that excellent weapon, the dread, terrible reputation which preceded us in the battles for Kharkov, fade, but will constantly add new meaning to it," said Himmler to the officers of 3 SS divisions in Kharkov in 1943. The Waffen-SS succeeded in constantly adding new meaning to its reputation for terror. Numerous instances have been submitted to the tribunal of the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity by units of the Waffen-SS. They are fresh in the tribunal's mind, and I will not recapitulate them. I would only remind the tribunal that some of the worst atrocities took place in 1943 and 1944, at which time a proportion of the Waffen-SS were conscripts. How can it be contended that the members of the SS, and particularly of the Waffen-SS, were merely soldiers who had no knowledge and took no part in these crimes? How can it be said that it was not they whose aims were criminal?
wherever we find Nazi crimes be committed, we find also SS men involved. Always it is said that these SS men were something special, members of the SD or some other particular branch, members of the SS who had been drafted away to serve with special units such as the Einsatz commanders, members of the SS who were not really SS men at all, but doctors or police. Can this be really so? Let us ignore the evidence of the concentration camps, of the Einsatz commanders, of the vast and brutal crimes against the population of their invaded territories, of the mass extermination of Jews throughout half the countries of Europe, of the legion instances of individual crime and sadism, of the legion other instances of murder in battle and of every other breach of the laws of warfare. Let us ignore the evidence of all these crimes, although each one of them was committed by different SS men in different towns and villages throughout the length and breadth of the Greater Reich. Let us ignore them, although they did not constitute one sudden wave of crime, but were being done day after day over the years. Let us ignore the fact that in almost no instance of crime of which we have heard were any other than SS men involved. Let us ignore all this if you wish. Without it, the criminality of the SS, from the highest to the lowest, is established by the records which we have of those 3 speeches that Himmler made to the officers of his SS units. In April 1941, he was talking to all the officers of the SS Division Leibstandarte. In October 1943, he was addressing his major generals at Posen. In the same month, the commanding officers of every regiment in 3 of his SS divisions were listening to what he said at Kharkov. Those speeches have been quoted to you again and again, and you know the sentiments that were expressed and the subject matter that they covered. Will you try to imagine a general from your own countries talking to all the officers of one of your own divisions of hauling into slavery thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, of shooting thousands of leading Poles? Will you try to imagine a British or an American or a Soviet or a French army commander telling his major generals, what happens to a Russian, to a Czech, does not interest me in the slightest. Whether 10,000 Russian females fall down from exhaustion while digging an anti-tank ditch interests me only insofar as the anti-tank ditch for Germany is finished. Or saying this, I also want to talk to you, quite frankly, on a very grave matter. I mean the clearing out of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish race. It's one of those things it's easy to talk about. The Jewish race is being exterminated, says one party member. That's quite clear. It's our program, elimination of the Jews, and we're doing it, exterminating them. And then they come, 80 million worthy Germans, and each one is his decent Jew. Of course, the others are vermin, but this one is an A1 Jew. Not one of all those who talk this way has witnessed it. Not one of them has been through it. Most of you must know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, or 500 or 1,000, to have stuck it out, and at the same time, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent fellows. That is what makes us hard. Can you see him telling all the commanding officers of one of his divisions, anti-Semitism is exactly the same as delousing, getting rid of lice is not a question of ideology, it's a matter of cleanliness. In just the same way, anti-Semitism for us has not been a question of ideology, but a matter of cleanliness. If you can imagine so much, can you imagine what you would say of the officers and the men that they commanded? Is it possible that officers and men in these Waffen-SS divisions, who could be spoken to in such a way, were high-minded, clean-living, decent and honorable soldiers? Such men, be they from Germany or from any other country in the world, would not tolerate these words. Those speeches have become hackneyed enough during the course of this trial, but they never lose their significance. They show that every member of these SS units was a prototype of his SS Führer. If it were not so, the defendant Goering would not have said, after telling Mussolini the horrors of Germany's method in fighting the partisans, I quote, members of the party discharge this task much more harshly and efficiently. The SS, the guard of the old fighters of the party, who have personal ties with the Führer and who form a special elite, confirm this principle. If it were not so, the defendant Hess could not have written, the units of the Waffen-SS are more suitable than other armed units for the specific tasks to be solved in the occupied Eastern territories, due to their intensive National Socialist training in regard to questions of race and nationality. We know what Hitler had in mind as the future role of the Waffen-SS. State police to impose German authority in the conquered countries. State police who would never fraternize with the proletariat and underworld. That was their destined role, which all the army knew, because, by order of the OKW, it had received the greatest publicity. We know enough of the Nazi state police, of the education and training of the Waffen-SS, and of the practical application of their training during these years of war to fit them for the task that lay ahead of them, to know also the sort of methods which they would have employed. It is those men, the men who were intended and had been trained to police and terrorize Europe, who compose the organization of the SS, which we ask you to convict as criminal. Such are the main considerations in connection with these three organizations, the core of political leaders, the SA and the SS, to which I desire to draw your attention. It was these organizations that provided the machinery by which the crimes that these defendants conceived were executed. These three organizations were not separate and distinct from each other, as their counsel have attempted to portray them. It was their members who together constituted, and still do, the fundamental and dangerous core of National Socialism. As the separate branches of the National Socialist elite, their aims and purposes were the same, and they worked and cooperated with each other, using the same methods which were criminal for all to see. From the outset, this was so and continued so until the end. Nothing more clearly demonstrates these things than the evidence of how the National Socialist Party and government debased the concepts of law and order and corrupted the judicial practice of their courts in order to protect themselves and their followers in the criminal courses they were pursuing. Hardly had the Nazi government come to power than the Nazi ministers, Nazi police and Nazi judiciary were condoning violence and murder committed by the SA and the SS and the Gestapo. And for what reasons? Reasons which must have demonstrated to all Germany and must demonstrate to all the world today the very rottenness of National Socialism. As the deed did not originate from ignoble motive, I quote, but rather served the achievement of an exceedingly patriotic aim and the advance of the National Socialist state, the quashing of the proceedings does not seem incompatible with the orderly administration of criminal justice. Such was the opinion of the public prosecutor to the provincial court in Nuremberg in respect of the SA men who had beaten a communist to death, beaten him until the soles of his feet were so swollen, I quote, owing to the mass of blood gathered there, that after the blood had been drained off by incision, pockets nearly the size of a fist were formed. In Munich, the state minister of the Interior was giving similar reasons for quashing proceedings against SS guards in Dachau who had beaten a prisoner on the head till he died. I quote again, as a reason it is pointed out that the conducting of investigations would cause great harm to the prestige of the National Socialist state, since these proceedings would be directed against members of the SA and SS, and thus the SA and SS, as the chief protagonists of the National Socialist state, would be immediately affected. Nazi judges were suspending proceedings against members of the SA in agreement with the supreme leadership of that organization. I quote again, the deed and intention of the SA men were only aimed at the well-being of the National Socialist movement. Political reason and the purity of intention is thus beyond doubt. When judges, not yet accustomed to these new conceptions of law, did convict SA guards,
who, I quote, not only attempted to wring confessions from inmates, but acted in a sheer lust for torture, they were at once expelled from the party. The prosecutor, who happened himself to be a member of the SA, was warned that he should resign, and the Gauleiter wrote to the Supreme Court advising that a pardon should be substituted for the sentence that had been imposed. Can there be any doubt that candidates for membership of these organizations did not know that membership afforded the license to murder? Nor were these concepts of law confined to the state and party courts. The military could not resist anything so attractive. By 1939, a military judge was granting to an S-man extenuating circumstances, I quote, because he was induced to participate in the shooting by a corporal handing him a rifle. He was in a state of irritation, owing to numerous atrocities committed by Poles against persons of German race. As an SS man, particularly sensitive at the sight of Jews and to the hostile attitude of Jewry to the Germans, he therefore acted quite thoughtlessly in a youthful spirit of adventure. These SS soldiers had been sentenced to imprisonment for manslaughter, which the army commander refused to confirm. It was for manslaughter of a kind known only to National Socialists who, as we have seen in this court, display a curious sensitiveness to the word murder. This they called manslaughter. After about 50 Jews who had been used during the day to repair a bridge had finished their work in the evening, these two men drove them all into a synagogue and shot them all without reason. Let me conclude by reminding you of the opinion of the Supreme Court, the supreme guardian of National Socialist honor and discipline, by whose august authority and jurisdiction the members of all these organizations were subject. Of the murders committed during the 1938 demonstration by Hoheitsschläger and members of the SA and SS, the investigation of which had been entrusted to the secret state police and party jurisdiction, of Gauleiters and other political leaders, it was pleaded that, I quote, in such cases as when Jews were killed without an order or contrary to orders, ignoble motives could not be determined. The purpose of those proceedings in the party court were, I quote again, to protect those party comrades who, motivated by decent National Socialist attitude and initiative, had overshot their mark. In these few lines, you have the secret of all the death and suffering, the horror and tragedy that these defendants and the members of these organizations have brought upon the world. You see to what depths of evil they corrupted the human conscience. No ignoble motives. The murder of women and children, the decent National Socialist attitude and initiative. Such was the National Socialist creed, which the members of those organizations fanatically accepted, the creed which, can one doubt, they still cherish and given the opportunity to do so would revive. With regard to the High Command and General Staff, it is not my intention to trespass on the ground which will be covered so well by my colleagues. Nevertheless, I want to state as clearly and emphatically as it may be stated that the British delegation unreservedly joins them in the request for the condemnation of the group indicted under that name. The men involved have joined in wars which they knew were unjust wars of aggression. They have borne essential parts in the deed which in the hands of their immediate perpetrators are undeniably war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yet they protest their innocence. Our case against them has as clear a basis on the facts of this case as in the lessons of history. They carried out orders which, on the admission of many of them, bit deep into the remnants of their consciences. They knew that what they were doing what was wrong. They now say, Befehl ist Befehl, an order is an order. All decent men find it difficult to blame others for absence of moral courage. They are only too conscious of their own failings in that direction. But there comes a point when, Faced with crimes which are obvious murder or barbarity, there is a higher duty. Even Dr. Latenza admitted that this was so. His suggestion to the witness Schreiber that he ought to have protested at the Army Staff's proposals for bacteriological warfare came strangely on behalf of those men whose very defense has been to declare the impossibility and uselessness of protest. What nonsense, what utter nonsense is this which you have been asked to listen to by these defendants and their generals, when their own counsel to discredit a witness must ask the very question which the prosecution have been asking of themselves since the day this trial began. In fairness to all military tradition, it should not go forth that soldiers have sheltered behind the letter of a command from facing moral problems and deciding them rightly or wrongly as moral problems. Great captains are not automata to be weighed against a rubber stamp. I need not traverse the history of our own military figures, the philosophy of Montrose, the brooding thoughts of Marshal Ney, the troubled heart of Robert E. Lee in 1861 to find examples. Two of the greatest names in German military history spring to one's mind. Von Clausewitz, leaving the Prussian army to serve in that of Russia. Jörg von Wartenberg, making his decision of neutrality. Both put what they deemed the needs of Europe and humanity above the orders of the moment. How much more clear and obvious was the duty when the work of drafting, issuing, and carrying out the Nacht- und Nebel decree, the Commando order, the Commissar order, Hitler's order to murder our 50 Air Force officers, meant the defiling of every idea which every soldier cherishes and holds dear. When, as all of them who ever served upon the Eastern Front could see with their own eyes, they were asked to support and cooperate in a calculated system of mass extermination and utter brutality. These men of all men knew their leader to be a callous murderer, yet for years they had met in conference after conference to sit at his feet and listen to his words. They fed his lust for power and enslavement with the best of their professional skill, while the defenseless peoples of the East, the men, women, and children of Poland or of the Soviet Union and of the Baltic states, were being deliberately slaughtered and deported into slavery to allow for German Lebensraum. These men talked of the necessities of war. When their own cities were bombed and Germans killed, they called it murder. Only in July 1944, when Hitler's star was dimmed, did 3 field marshals and 5 colonel generals recognize that he was murdering also their own country and take action. When that star was rising in victory, they had hailed it and ignored the blood-red color of the clouds from which it rose. So much for the facts and the merits. It is perhaps permissible to say one word on the construction of the Charter. The use of the 2 words, group or organization, surely connotes that the entity in question may have been either formally organized by the Nazis or selected by the prosecution as a group which existed in living reality. This group was united by its special knowledge given at so many conferences and voluntarily bound by the transmission of these criminal orders. For that reason, we ask that it should be condemned. With regard to the Reichsregierung also, I only desire to make it clear that the British prosecution is again asking unhesitatingly for a conviction. Beyond this, I wish to make 2 points only. Some question has been raised as to the position of those non-Nazis who joined the cabinet in 1933. If anyone in that cabinet did not know to what he was committing himself on the 30th January 1933, he had a very good idea in March when the Jews were attacked. His knowledge increased in April when the whole nation was organized in boycotting the Jews and the official figures of 20,000 people under arrest were given in the German press. In June 1934, he knew that murder was being used as an instrument of policy. In 1935 and 1936, he knew that the foreign policy was being carried on at the calculated risk of war. The other point on which I want to comment is the picture given by the defense of ministers in complete ignorance of what was going on. In my submission, government does not function like that. Whether totalitarian or democratic, a government can only act in dealing with human beings. The lives of human beings are not lived in watertight compartments. Their infinitely varying interests are inextricably interlocked. The most completely authoritarian minister must, as indeed Dr. Kabushok in his speech was disposed to agree, consider the repercussion of his actions on the acts of his colleagues. In other words, he must know what is going on. It is because the men of this group knew what was going on, supported it, and took the principal positions and richest rewards of the state for themselves as a price of such support that we ask for the conviction of the organization today. I've endeavored to show how the SD and the Gestapo fit into the scheme of the Nazi state. As one would expect, the evidence which I've mentioned introduces them in innumerable ways. Beyond once more emphasizing my support of my colleagues' plea for their conviction, I do not intend to comment further on those organizations. My Lord, I am deeply conscious that one of the greatest difficulties, and not the least of the dangers of this trial, is that those of us who have been engaged day in and day out for over 9 months have reached the saturation point of horror. Shakespeare attempted to picture that saturation point in the memorable lines, "Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, that mothers shall but smile when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war. All pity choked through custom of fell deeds." It is only when we stand a little apart from what has been our daily companion for 40 weeks that we realize that the domestic fury and fierce civil strife, the results of which Mark Antony was prophesying, are an inconsiderable bagatelle beside the facts that we have had to consider. It is not merely the quantity of horrors, although these organizations have been the instruments of death for 22 million people. It is the quality of cruelty which produced the gas chambers of Auschwitz or the routine shooting of Jewish children throughout a continent claiming to be civilized. There is not one of these organizations which is not directly connected with the sorry trade of murder in a brutal form. Who can doubt the Reich Cabinet knew of the euthanasia used to conserve the physical resources of Germany for war? It is beyond question that the High Command and General Staff passed on these orders of which you have heard so much, and which are all reduced in the end to plain murder. The leadership corps shared in killing Jews and ruining the bodies of slave laborers. I have simply to mention the SS, and the crimes come unbidden into the mind without any words of mine. Conniving, assisting, and finding a reason for these crimes were the SD and the Gestapo. The SA trained its Baltic recruits to reach the SA standard, which came to fruition in the ghetto of Kaunas or the pit at Vilna. The late President Woodrow Wilson once said, "It is indispensable that the governments associated against Germany should know beyond a peradventure with whom they are dealing. If Europe is to be cleansed of Nazi evil, it is indispensable that you and the world should know these organizations for what they are. It has been our somber task to assist you to this knowledge. Having done so, we sometimes wonder if the stench of death will ever wholly pass from our nostrils. But we are determined to do our utmost to see that it will pass from Germany, and that the spirit which produced it will be exorcised."
It may be presumptuous for lawyers who do not claim to be more than the cement of society to speculate or even dream of what we wish to see in its place. But I give you the faith of a lawyer. Some things are surely universal. tolerance, decency, kindliness. It is because we believe that there must be a clearance before such qualities will flourish in peace that we ask you to condemn this organization of evil. When such qualities have been given the chance to flourish in the ground that you have cleared, a great step will have been taken. It will be a step towards the universal recognition that sights and sounds, all happy as a day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness and hearts at peace are not the prerogative of any one nation. They are the inalienable heritage of mankind.
The tribunal will adjourn.